Good morning and welcome to the 16th meeting in 2013 of the Health and Sport Committee. And as usual at this point, can I remind those present to switch off all mobile phones and Blackberries, as they can often interfere with the sound system. People around the table and indeed in the public gallery may also notice that some members are using iPads, and this is instead of hard copies of the committee papers. And we now move to our first item on the agenda, which is to discuss as a committee item number 5, which is work programme discussion, and is normally taken in private. Can I have the committee's agreement to take item 5 in private? Thank you. We now move on to agenda item number 2, which is to turn once again to the issue of access to newly licensed medicines. As everyone is aware, the Scottish Government reviews of the operation of the Scottish Medicine Consortium and individual patient treatment request systems have been carried out. So we, in the interest of time, we're going to make some progress. And we normally ask everybody to introduce themselves right round the table. I think we all know why we're here, looking at those reviews and in response to those reviews. So I'm going to go directly to the first question and ask those who come in with a comment question just to introduce themselves at that point, just to make progress. So could I go to Bob Doris for the committee's first question?
Thank you, Convener. And I think I want to get straight into the body of some of the recommendations for the reviews that are before us, because I know that the witnesses here will want to give some opinions on that. One of the issues raised with individual patient treatment requests was the support for individual clinicians in terms of getting expert clinical opinion in relation to medical advice about how individual patients would demonstrate a response to the medication in question beyond their peer group by which the medication had initially not been accepted by SMC. One of the recommendations, recommendation 10, is that there should be established, maintained a register of specialists to support individual patient treatment requests. Now, I see some advantages of that in terms of supporting the consistent application of IPTRs across Scotland, but rather than having my views on that, I'm much more keen to hear the views of the witnesses here today.
Does anyone wish to respond? Yes.
David Flegger, NHS Grampian. I think we broadly support the availability of that advice, or easy access to that advice, and having that national list would, I'm sure, be a useful addition to the IPTR process.
Any other views on that before I develop my question further? Okay, well, can I suggest a possibility in relation to the list of specialists? If an individual clinician chooses not to consult with a nationally recognised specialist before submitting an IPTR, do any of the witnesses feel that could compromise their ability to put in an effective individual patient treatment request, or have they not given it consideration? I'm hoping to get some comments in relation to the recommendations within these reports today.
From NHS Lothian and the University of Edinburgh. I think in terms of your question, it depends on the context and the disease that's being treated. For some diseases, they're only treated by sort of national specialists anyway, and so it would be difficult to see how those submissions would benefit further, because probably those individuals that would be on a specialist group anyway. But imagine there are other conditions where a generalist might decide that an IPTR would be appropriate, and certainly under those circumstances, if they're not familiar with the process, then certainly such a group of experts would be beneficial.
you want to come in there again?
It was a very similar comment. I think if we were to say that you had to access that group of experts every time, then it will probably just slow the process and will be not appropriate for a lot of the requests. But I think where a clinician making a request feels they need that extra support, then it would be a useful resource. I guess the danger comes in then, do you then set yourself up to the position where, I think as you were alluding to, if you haven't accessed that, then have you then not done your best for the patient through the IPTR process? So I think there is a question about when it's required to be used, and to my mind that's really about the clinician's need for that support and resource, rather than some very strict protocol based that you have to go and access that resource.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Lee? Yes.
Support the ability to have specialist advice. I think we are probably quite fortunate that as a larger board we have quite a lot of specialists who can help one another through the process, which I think is good. I think where we might have some difficulty is where the expert advice comes from south of the border, where they are not aware of the IPTR process and that decision making. And so I think that might be worthy of some further discussion. But the general principle of having experts I think is good, because I think the submissions from clinicians who are being supported by their peers of experts is certainly much improved.
Lee Smith?
That more or less mirrors what I was thinking, that if we have to have another clinician in Scotland, there may not be anyone else, because particularly in the case of our cancer, melanoma, there's probably only one clinician in Scotland who will have any experience of using the drug and would therefore not have a colleague to go to, and would have to go to London for help there, and they don't know the process. Thank you.
Okay, Bob?
Okay, thank you. Now, I know it seems very process-driven, the question, but one of the things the Cabinet Secretary asked us to do is to look at the recommendations of the reports before us and to report back to him before the government then considers their steps. Another suggestion was made this time in relation to how each of the 14 health boards, or rather area drug and therapeutic committees, the time they take to get medicines that are approved by the Scottish Medicines Consortium onto the local formulary has been unduly slow. The target is, of course, for 3 months, and that's been inconsistently met or not met, as the case may be, across the country. One of the things this committee looked at is why on earth do we have 14 ADTCs in the first place? Now, we did hear some strong evidence that ADTCs do much more, of course, than just put drugs and medicines onto national formularies, so that when a drug is approved by SMC, you get it speedily at a local level, which of course everyone should do, and that's simply not the case at the moment. So I accept we have to, for the moment, stick with 14 ADTCs. However, should we be looking in the future for, whether in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, a national formulary? So we're not looking at Glasgow, Edinburgh, Aberdeen, Dundee, taking different periods of time to get SMC approvals onto the local list of available drugs. So perhaps regional formularies at the moment, and I think managed clinical networks might actually do some work in relation to that currently. But where do you see the system of getting drugs approved by SMC in the first instance, making sure they're speedily and consistently available at a local level?
Sorry, Melinda Cuthbert, NHS Lothian. I think that Professor Swainson's report with regard to the ADTCs, I support what he has in there, that I don't think that you should dissolve these ADTCs as they stand, because actually you could be disengaging a lot of the local clinicians which contribute and feel ownership for the formularies that are there. I think that we do have some models, as in cancer, and that whereby there is some regionality there, so potentially there is some room there. But I think that with regard to timelines to bring medicines into the formularies, I don't think it's a race. I think you have to give clinicians the opportunity to be able to consider the medicines, where they're going to fit within their treatment guidelines, to be able to safely introduce them. And if you're doing it faster than what they can actually meet to make those decisions, then you could actually be introducing more risk into the system. And certainly there might be an increase in cost as well if you get disengagement from the local prescribers.
Any other views on that?
Yes, David.
I think Charles Swainson was quite clear in his report about the advantages of the 14 ADTCs and against the other models that you're talking about, the regional and the national approach. I think if we go back to the crux of your question was around the timescales to consider SMC advice and then formulate the local response. And I think given his scrutiny around Health Improvement Scotland scrutiny around those processes since the introduction of the 90-day time guidance, that has certainly focused us on how we make sure our systems try and comply with that. So I think there is a tool there. There's some that we have a clear indication that we need to do it by the 90 days. I think Charles Swainson is recommending that we are more open and transparent in the steps along those 90 days as to where we are within our process and what we're trying to achieve, so that patients and other stakeholders can understand what's going on. So I think that's useful. I think with regard to the regional work, I think that grows naturally, to use an overused word, maybe organically. In other words, you've got areas where regionalisation is more advanced than others, so the cancer networks being key examples of that. And I think as Charles Swainson indicates, there isn't massive disparity in terms of the formularies and choices that we make across Scotland. There are differences, but I think what we need to accept is that ADTCs aren't just about new drugs. They have much, much wider roles around medicines governance. And so I think if we include those as well and think about the clinical engagement, the clinician engagement that we get through the local processes, I think if we can make sure that we're hitting the timelines that we want, then we can have both, is what I'm saying. We can have the advantages of the local clinician engagement, the local medicines governance, but we can also meet the timelines and aspirations around implementation of SMC decisions.
Professor Webb.
So I really don't want to say anything much more, but just to really endorse that point that the ADTCs do a lot more than just new drugs. They provide local ownership, local engagement in the process. They provide a forcing ground for training clinicians who may subsequently join SMC, take on a national role. There are local factors that sometimes affect the introduction of drugs. So I think for those reasons and others, I think it would be valuable to maintain that local structure. And I think that was Charles Swainson's intent.
Yeah, convener, that was certainly the intent, but I think he said that that ADTCs do get bogged down on this, but they do a variety of other things that we should support, but they could be working far closer and integrated together on getting drugs to local formulary. And my constituents would be confused to why ADTCs in some parts of the country can do it speedily and safely, but in other parts of the country they're far more laborious about it. And I would rather access to a new medicine was delayed for it to be introduced safely, quite frankly. Of course I would, but what I'm looking to do is finding a way where we can change the structure to make sure the best practice to get it speedily and quickly available at a local level is done on a consistent basis. So do you think there's room for improvement here, and do you think there's room for integration, not merger of the ADTCs, but integration of some of the functions of the ADTCs? Because I'd want to make sure that they were keen to work closely together rather than defend their own institutional viewpoint that this is what we do locally.
Yes?
Absolutely. I'm working together. I'm not sure of integration, just a terminology, but certainly working together, and we have some examples of that. So thinking about the IPTR process, North of Scotland boards met around that particular process to share best practice and some learning. But also it's about how we share the resources that we have. So in the same way that we combine across ADTCs in the Scottish Medicines Consortium, there are certain things that we need to come together with other ADTCs, particularly at a regional level. And that, I think, becomes more important when we're talking about the MCN work. Because where you've got a regional MCN, then it seems sensible to engage with that MCN across all of the ADTCs working together. Absolutely. So less wedded to the integration model, absolutely wedded to the working together and reducing any duplication and maximising our use of the expertise and resources that we have.
Mr. Fledger, and then I'll let some of my colleagues in. I don't want to get hung up on this process, but you had mentioned previously that this could organically grow in terms of you did use integration, but you did use closer working together and be more speedy. If in 18 months' time we were to find out that there was still a considerable difference between, say, Aberdeen, Dundee, Glasgow, Edinburgh, or wherever in Scotland, do you think structural steps would have to be taken to deal with the issue? Because if the 14 ADTCs are working more closely together, they are making greater use of managed clinical networks, they are more open and transparent, and they are sharing best practice. Given the focus this report provides to speeding up this process consistently, should we expect to see minimal differences in 18 months' time in terms of the approval process at a local level?
Just to clarify, the differences that you're focusing on are the approval of SMC medicines?
The placing of SMC medicines onto local formularies so they're available routinely at a local level in all 14 health boards.
Okay, so we need to accept that medicines that are approved by SMC will have alternative treatments locally, and part of that decision-making process is about which medicine local clinicians come together in a peer review process of deciding which is their first choice. So there will be differences. If there are differences in, I think if you look at the Charles Swainson report, when he interviewed the stakeholders, he didn't find issues in terms of accessing SMC-approved medicines that weren't on local formularies. We need to remember formularies don't cover 100% of usage. So he didn't come across that being an issue because there were alternatives in place. And if people weren't going to use that alternative and wanted to use the SMC-approved medicine, there were routes for them to be able to do that. So I'm less convinced of the outcome being one that would trigger a full structural change. I think it's about having the appropriate medicine on the formulary. It's absolutely being about transparent and open and engaged with members of the public and patients in those processes. I'm just less convinced of the outcome being that if we haven't got absolute uniformity of SMC medicines on our formularies, that's necessarily the outcome that we're looking for.
I think that's a good bit of clarity you provide. I should be careful in what I say. It's more about the time it takes for each health board to come to decision as to where it's appropriate to use that new medicine or not. It's those differences that I think we want to iron out. I think you make a very good point about, for example, Me Too medicines in different parts of the country and traditional usage of it and risk-averse clinicians locally, and we've been through all that as a committee. I think it's more about the time it takes all 14 ADTCs inconsistently to decide how to use the medicines in the local formulary, but I thank you for that clarity.
And that, I think if you come back in the timescale you're talking about and we haven't achieved those timelines, then and we haven't got reasons for that, then I think, yes, come and hold us to account, absolutely.
Why did we have to have the review and the inquiry for you to address that issue when it was clear that different health boards took different lengths of time to give people access to medicines that were licensed, agreed by NICE, agreed by SMC, and we've got another role here because our inquiry started off looking at why there was delay and denial of access to new medicines. So the people that came along to us and gave us evidence in that process were telling us it could take up to 8 months in some cases for health boards to finally prescribe and give access to people. And of course, when we're talking about end-of-life drugs and medicines, then there's not much point in that. So why, if we've known about these problems and dismissing them so lightly today, have we not acted? Yes, Mr. Lowe.
Okay. I mean, I think there's different things at play here. I mean, we've obviously heard from the NHS perspective, and I think there's a difference between something going on a formulary and clinicians having the ability to prescribe what they think is best for their patients, and they're two different things. So something can go on a formulary, but it doesn't require a doctor to prescribe it if they don't think it's safe and it's the best medicine for their patient. So I think it's important to differentiate between clinical practice and formulary. So we can put things on a formulary as quickly as we want or as slowly as we want, but nobody's holding a gun to a clinician's head saying you must prescribe this drug to your patient. So clinicians must have the ability to choose from available options what they deem to be their best treatment option for their patient. That decision shouldn't be influenced, hopefully, by the cost of drugs. That should not be the big factor for not getting it to kind of patients. From a patient perspective, I think where some of this stuff might have come from is on the ground they had experienced delays in getting access to treatments that had been approved by SMC. And in some circumstances, that's not appropriate. We can't deny patients access to treatments that have been approved. So whatever these local factors are that prevent the timely adoption of effective treatments under the formulary, we need to address that. But I'm not sure that it's clinicians not wanting to prescribe the drug. They want to get good drugs to their patients. So I think we need to be clear that getting stuff on the formulary is one part of the problem. We need to do that quickly and efficiently to give clinicians the ability to prescribe the drugs that they think are best for their patients as soon as possible.
Anyone else?
From Greater Glasgow and Clyde's perspective, I mean, I certainly think that we strive to achieve the 90-day target. Where we don't, it is usually because we are getting clinicians to agree that where it fits within a patient's pathway and protocol, and it's getting that agreement that sometimes will take us over the 90 days. And I think, given the Swainson report, we will be looking at ways in which we can get something in that interim phase onto the formulary. So, I mean, I hope that many boards will be looking at this report and how we might get things earlier onto the formulary.
Yes, certainly.
So I think that's a job for clinicians to get ahead of the curve to make sure that they can anticipate innovation and developments for early adoption. But isn't one of the issues that if you decided, for example, that the best place in the pathway for that drug was different to SMC guidance, how do you marry up the fairly strict SMC guidance around using drug A at point B and the clinician's desire to use drug A at point C, which you could very well come up with? So how do you overcome that issue?
Standard protocol, which is used but for individual patients. If a clinician wishes to use that, there is just some minor administration that they would have to go through to get it prescribed.
Okay, so you have the ability to effectively ignore SMC guidance and use that drug in a
if it's
pathway.
been SMC approved.
Yeah, but so you can use it at a different stage of the disease. Okay, because I think what you said was that you'd deliberate to work out where in the pathway to put it, but it's quite clear from NICE guidance where the appraisal is.
I think generally SMC guidance doesn't give you just where it is in the pathway, but the clinicians themselves are wishing to decide where they would put it in their priority order for prescribing. But if a clinician particularly had some evidence that it would be better for one patient to receive it at this time, then there is an ability to do that.
Anyone else? In terms of the recommendations, then, can we have some ideas about what you will take out of those recommendations and what actions you will take as health boards to address this delay and issues there, or do you take the review and its recommendations as everything's okay and you're all doing fine? Yes, Melinda.
Melinda Cuthbert here. NHS Lothian, I've looked through the reports. There's a lot of the stuff that we are already meeting the boxes that are there. Some of the things which need to be achieved, actually, it's resource issues. So if we're going to be able to deliver training to all doctors on IPTR processes, there's a resource issue there. If we're going to be able to provide greater support to patients, to be able to engage with the IPTR process, again, it's a resource issue that is the thing that we need to look at there. With regard to the recommendation for making our formulary decisions more visible, we already have an external website. The issue that which was identified, I think, for ourselves was that it wasn't freely put in an important or noticeable place on the NHS Lothian internet page so that patients could get to it. But once you actually got to the site, the information is there.
Is there any other of the recommendations that you've looked at is going to require increased resources from the board?
I can't speak for the clinicians, obviously, that have to make the decisions with regard to where they're going to put treatment within their protocols. But again, most of the clinicians, I would think that their main remit is seeing the patient in front of them trying to deliver care. So sometimes actually trying to find the time to have these meetings or to make these decisions is another resource issue. But I will let the clinicians around the table speak to that element.
Yes, David.
Just to speak generally first and then specifically, so if you look at the broad themes that have come out of the two reports, increased transparency, increase in ease of information access for patients and that information and the public, and for that information to be understandable. Not increasing public involvement, but an assurance about public involvement in ADTC processes. An introduction or an improvement in some of the scrutiny that will go on, and some roles there for Health Improvement Scotland. And I think all of that's to be welcomed, but I think, as Melinda says, scrutiny does come with implications in terms of resource, and that resource comes from somewhere else, so there's always an opportunity cost with that. But I accept that from a trust perspective, we need to rebuild the trust with the public and the patients around our processes, around our systems. So that resource may well be well used, but it does come from somewhere else in the system.
Professor Webb.
Sorry, I was just going to, in terms of the SMC recommendations, the Citizens Panel may provide a useful forum to have some of the societal discussions about how much and what we're willing to pay for medicines, and some of the modifiers that perhaps SMC are able to use around their discussion about cost per quality. And I think that societal debate is absolutely needed. So a forum within which that can take place would be very, very welcome. I think some of the things we need to remember are that it's how we implement some of these recommendations without impeding the responsiveness of the system that we have. So SMC are very quick, really, to generate the advice to Scotland. And we don't want to impede that. So it's how some of these recommendations go into play at SMC level, at ADTC level, at IPTR level, without slowing the system, because that's not what we want to happen. So we just need to be wary of that. But generally, I found the recommendations to be most useful. And as far as the recommendations for ADTCs, I didn't see any of them that I wouldn't want to go back and begin implementing, or just to assure that we are achieving the aspirations that are in there. There's some bits of detail that need to be clarified, because otherwise I'm sure we'll be back discussing and arguing some of that detail. So there's some bits we'll need to just agree on. But in the main, yes, welcome. Thank you.
Have you calculated an increase in the prescribing bill as a result of any of the recommendations?
Okay, so that brings you to the crux of the matter, really. If you look at the ABPI submission, it clearly says that the start of this process was around access to new medicines. For once, I will agree with ABPI on something, which is that this in itself doesn't necessarily improve access to new medicines in Scotland. At the end of the day, you have a triangle of cost of a medicine, of clinical effectiveness of a medicine, and the willingness of a health system to purchase a medicine at a cost effectiveness level. None of the discussions we've had change that at all. The only out to that is the Rarer Conditions Medicines Fund and the group patient treatment request that's included in that. So, for example, the ivacaftor as a group. So the issue, what we will have is much more, hopefully, responsiveness, much more transparency, much more openness, much more, hopefully, person-centeredness in the IPTR process. Does it change globally the national level of access? Well, we still have, if SMC are still using the cost per qualities and modifiers that they currently do, then the rates of yeses and nos will remain unchanged from SMC.
Then you, Eric.
So,
yeah.
Speaking as a clinician, I've been pleased to hear at this meeting and previous meetings the support there generally is for the work of SMC. It's never been about cost, it's always been about getting the best value for money from NHS funds and trying to do that in an equitable way for patients. I'm also broadly supportive of the recommendations. I'm broadly supportive of more openness. The recommendations from Professor Routledge, who runs the All Wales Medicine Strategy Group, do very much look like the inclusion for SMC of many of the things that his group does. So we're moving towards the sort of activity done in Wales if we take up his recommendations. SMC started before that group. SMC has a substantially greater business than that group. We look at all medicines. They look at a relatively selected group of medicines, not always the difficult medicines. And I know that although they have open meetings, much of the work, the decisions are made in camera. So there's always a private final discussion and decision. My concern as a clinician is that if we went to a very much more open process with then the public leaving so that we can have decisions in camera, the meetings may be substantially longer, and that's another resource issue. It's not just a resource issue for time for the clinicians and pharmacists and all the people involved in that process. I worry that clinicians who already give of their time to come to these meetings will find that extra workload, perhaps doubled or more, will make them disengage from the SMC process, and that would be a tragedy.
So just to pick up on David's point, I think he got to the crux of the matter very eloquently, and it wasn't part of the review, is this issue around why do we get no's from SMC, and I think that's where we need to focus, because ultimately what we want to do is to get more yeses and reduce the reliance on individual patient treatment requests. It's not the way to make these decisions, and that's what we're focusing on. And I think what we need to do is to work with the SMC, we think have a willingness to really engage and to focus in on their mechanisms and their modifiers to make sure that we can say more yeses. But I think we need to strike this balance between magnitude of benefit and high prices. As the professor here said, it's striking that balance, and that's the crux of the matter. And I think that's not the discussion, it's not the question, it's not the debate that we've had. And I think, to be fair to the SMC, to some extent they have held back from maybe addressing that issue themselves, because we've been working on the VBP thing and we've been waiting to understand what role VBP will have in Scotland. As far as I can see, VBP may not be practical. I think that gives us a wonderful opportunity now to sit down with SMC, with stakeholders, and address the issue of how we can strike the balance between demand-orientated healthcare from clinicians and patients, but the ability and willingness of payers to pay a price that is fair and represents value. And that's the crux of the matter. If we can fix that, in Scotland, then the issues we're talking about around formularies and individual patient treatment requests will become the exception rather than the norm. So I think we're focusing in on the wrong issue. Now, in Scotland, if there's not an appetite for a cancer drugs fund, which there isn't, and you know that's fine, the rare disease thing may work in some situations, and if VBP is not going to be practical in Scotland, but we know current mechanisms need improvement, that's what we've got to focus on, and we've got to find a solution to help the SMC make better decisions, get more yeses, and I guess empower the Scottish Government to sit with pharma and have a grown-up discussion around a price that represents good value for NHS resources, means that no patient should be denied access to a drug that their doctor thinks they will benefit from, and a price that gives pharma some sustainability, some security, some certainty about how this market is going to respond. I don't think it's that complex. I think that's the solution. We just haven't had the debate. We haven't had the discussion. I think we've been looking under the wrong stone for the solution.
Dr. MacDonald and then Professor Gourley.
I'd just like to build up on the comments we've just heard, that the bottom line has to be patients getting access to valuable medicines that have been accepted by SMC. And I'd say that we were disappointed that the recommendations, we support most of the recommendations, but we were disappointed that they didn't say very much about some of the SMC-related methodological issues. And the SMC, we also appreciate, is excellent and does a very valuable job. But some of the evidence that was put forward related to some of the methods. And I think there were three aspects. One was the societal aspect, and there is the suggestion of a Scottish Citizens' Council parallel to England, where we can have a discussion, does society want to pay more in certain areas? So I think that's step one, which is very valuable. I think step two is the methods per se. And as Prof. Rutledge said, in some disease states, the QALYs are less than perfect. It's true they're probably the most validated tool at the moment, but it doesn't mean that you can't further enhance the methods that you use. And for example, some of the long-term central nervous system conditions, or if you take things like motor neuron disease, Professor Rutledge says on page 25, 26, there are some conditions where the patient gets used to their condition and their utility doesn't show up. So if somebody has motor neuron disease, for example, they will say that their utility is fine. So you can develop an effective medicine, but you probably won't get the sensitivity in a QALY. And yes, the QALY is still the best tool, but it doesn't mean you can't add something on top. So I do think there's a methodology discussion that has just escaped. It's been touched upon, but it's escaped any recommendation. And I think the third one is the wider aspect of value, which is what about diseases where there's a wider social burden, be it on a provider supporter for, again, a child or somebody with Alzheimer's, or there's a burden on other aspects of social care which are being paid for by the social care bill. So I think that point has also been missed out of the recommendations, and it was certainly mentioned by many in evidence. So I think there were three key points, and the social value has been picked up, but the methodology area, I think, hasn't been, and the wider value has also not been picked up. And I think that's a disappointment from our point of view, because we think they're some of the hub issues that need to be addressed. Otherwise, we're back to discussing IPTRs, and that's not the route to giving patients access.
Professor Gourley.
Thanks. Yes, I'm glad we've actually come round to what is the crux of the issue here. The recommendations in these reports, a lot of them are very welcome. But the issue is that if IPTR rules are applied properly, then they are not a mechanism to access SMC not approved drugs. And it's not fair of us to give patients the message that they might access SMC not approved drugs in this way. And GPTRs and the Rare Conditions Fund aren't going to change that for the vast majority of patients. So, if we are going to improve access to drugs, we need to find another way. Now, SMC, they do a good job, but they can only do what they're told to do, and that's to make a decision regarding cost effectiveness. The fact that there's a Rare Conditions Fund in Scotland and a CDF in England shows that there's a social and a political will to provide access to drugs beyond that which is mandated by SMC and NICE. But we do have an opportunity in Scotland because we have some strengths, and with value-based pricing coming in, we've got some strengths that we can, I think we should be using SMC as a route to get the drugs rather than how it's perceived now, which for clinicians it's perceived as a bit of a barrier. And that is that we're a nation of 5 million people. We've got fantastic data acquisition through ISD, and certainly on the cancer side, we're moving towards a single electronic chemotherapy prescribing system. So we could have the potential to go to these pharma companies. Most of these drugs that are coming out are drugs that have just been licensed. And we can say, we could provide you with post-licensing data on safety and tolerability. So on the basis of that, we want a good price for the drug. Now, obviously, some of these negotiations would have to go on behind closed doors because, you know, if you're negotiating a drug that's a price that's specific for Scotland on the basis of what we are giving back, then that may not be good for pharma for that to be broadcast. But I think we should be looking at that sort of model in order that we can ensure that Scottish people get all the best new drugs. Obviously, you'd have to expand SMC slightly, but there is going to be a drug saving, I believe, in the Scottish drug budget of about £316 million between 2012 and 2015. So you know, there is scope there.
Rachel Timoney.
Rachel Timoney from SMC. I haven't spoken yet because I think it's important to hear everyone else's views, but I particularly liked what Professor Gourley was saying, and we haven't had a discussion about this. You'll see from the submission from SMC that we have no desire to stop people having access to medicines. What we want is people to get good medicines at a price that's fair for all. And we really have to think constructively about how we're going to achieve that. And so the recommendations in the report are good, but they're about process. And so some of our concerns at SMC is that all we're doing is putting in more processes. It might slow us down a little bit. You might give us more resource so that we don't slow down. It probably isn't really going to change the decisions that we make. Possibly a little bit around the ultra-orphans, but not necessarily. Is that going to address the issues this committee has raised as concerns? I would like to look at a different way to do this, and I think we have to think about a different way to do this. This inquiry arose because of concerns from patients with rare diseases and from the cancer patients. And there's a challenge there about, do you, as a Scottish government, wish to treat those groups differently? And you heard very clearly from Professor Swainson and Professor Routledge that they thought they shouldn't be treated differently. And personally, I don't think they should be treated differently, but I think we should find a way that's fair for all, around all medicines, and we need to look at that.
I agree with Professor Timoney. I honestly believe that the SMT, within their remit, do an absolutely superb job. And I was delighted to hear you come up with what I thought was maybe one of my own cookie notions, that we should be looking at the real value that we get from the products via something like a post-marketing surveillance. Scotland's not such a huge country, and we have got 4 centres for cancer treatments. So it should be possible to collect the data on what the real outcomes are for these very expensive drugs. And if the outcomes are not as good for our population, there must be a way of going back to the companies and renegotiating a price, almost giving, could we have a probationary period? We'll pay you that price for a year till we get a bit more knowledge of your product, and then we'll sit down and renegotiate. So I'm delighted that you come up with the same cookie notion. Thank you.
McDonald.
This is a difficult one to comment on, but the principle of looking at the long-term outcomes of your medicines actually is welcomed by all, including the pharmaceutical industry, and it's remarkably difficult to get it. I've worked in prior life in the industry on some rare diseases, and we were desperate to get the real long-term outcome data, and there was a few specialist centres, but the centres couldn't agree endpoints, the data system didn't work, etc. So actually, the industry would welcome the ability to get some long-term, robust data. And actually, the PPRS, the last one, the one that's going to run out soon, has some text in there that does allow for flexible pricing in both directions. So there actually is, and industry signed up to that. So the principle of what you're talking about is not that contentious. It's actually trying to get it to work practically. which has been the challenge so far. But you know, outcomes can go in either direction once you actually collect the real data. So we would agree with the principle.
For that, Nanette Millen.
I mean, a lot of what I was going to ask has just been very ably discussed in the last little while. I would just maybe touch on the value-based pricing. I mean, we had a briefing last week, as you know, from the Department of Health on plans for value-based pricing. Does anyone think that's going to make any significant difference to what we're discussing just now in Scotland?
No views? Yes.
Yep. So I think the principles. Sorry. Oh, sorry. So I think the principles of value-based pricing are sound, and I think we've just discussed them, that we need to have a broader assessment of value to better understand the value of a drug to patients and the NHS and the taxpayer. But I think there are some practical issues around the introduction of value-based pricing into Scotland. And I think you could argue that by default what the SMC do anyway is a form of value-based pricing. So it seems to me that what we need to focus in on, and it's consistent with the discussions we've just had, is what can we do to work with the SMC to potentially have a broader assessment of value based on the principles of value-based pricing that will allow more informed decisions, let's say, about the value of a drug to Scotland, providing we can agree on a price that's appropriate, because that is the issue. So I think that Scotland now has an opportunity to either embrace VBP as part of the SMC process, or to take the principles of VBP and modify some of its methods to have a broader assessment of value, and an additional discussion, whether it be by the government with industry, on price, should the outcome of that remain a no.
Professor Timoney.
I was here at your meeting last week when there was a presentation of value-based pricing, and it's still quite confusing and not clear what value-based pricing is going to mean for Scotland. It seemed to me that what Katie Peters said last week was that there would be free pricing at the point of launch, complying with the European Transparency Directive. And then that after that, that NICE would undertake a value-based assessment on behalf of England. And there seems to be an expectation that the launch price, the list price, will somehow or other be quite close to whatever comes out as the value-based price, and that would be fine. But as you know, NICE don't look at all medicines, and SMC look at all medicines. So you could argue that we do that already. We assess the price, that's the value-based price that's come through. We perhaps need to do some more wider assessment of values, and we may change some of that. But the outcome for SMC is that we still say that 30% of those medicines don't meet that value-based price. And if that's the case, then what happens next? And Katie Peters didn't make that clear. For the medicines that we say that's not a value-based price, that's not cost-effective, is there a proposal that then we'll go back and have a discussion and a pricing discussion, or is it a reimbursement discussion? Because if it's a pricing discussion, it's reserved. If it's a reimbursement discussion, it's devolved, and it's still not clear to me what Scotland's role is in this. And I think those are really important things for us to determine, because actually that will determine whether, in fact, we can get medicines at a price that's fair for all.
I mean, the point that dawned to me last week, apart from the confusion, many people have been saying over a period of time, it's almost been convenient. So, well, value-based pricing, that's going to be the single bill that's going to help us resolve this issue. It wasn't obvious to me that whatever comes out of those discussions with the UK Health Department and others, that was going to be any assistance to us here, and that it wasn't obvious. Why are we waiting on it? Why aren't we just getting on with it and building on the reputation of the SMC and expanding that? Is there anything to prevent us doing that?
No, the issue for me is that pricing is a reserved matter, and that is for the UK government to determine. And it seemed to me for the first time when they brought in value-based pricing, it's different from PPRS, that they were suddenly introducing an element of health technology assessment, i.e. what we do, into the pricing mechanism. But if they chose to do that, that's a reserved matter. So there was a challenge for us in terms of addressing that, so we had to see what VBP was going to look like. I'm still not clear what that will be. But it seems to me that some work clearly has been done around looking at those wider assessments of value, and they may be of benefit for us in terms of our decision makers within SMC, but we haven't seen it yet.
Bob, you want to come in on that one?
Yeah. Now moving to what I actually would like to have spoken about rather than at the start, which was very process driven, because I was trying to elicit opinion on the two reports that are before us. I was struck last week in relation to the Department of Health witness who seemed to be saying value-based pricing is reserved in one breath, and then the next breath saying it's not reserved. And my understanding is the consultation that started in late 2010, discussions around value-based pricing, and it seemed clear to everyone, because it was this committee's understanding this was a major reserved thing that was going to have huge implications to the SMC and how we might develop modifiers in the future. And last week, for the first time, I had the niggling feeling that there's been a hiatus for up to 3 years where we could have been getting on developing modifiers and the appropriateness of cost per quality and taking in social care costs and pricing mechanisms and discussions with pharmaceutical companies about, well, you know, the time release benefits financially is year 5, 6, 7, can we get a discount year 1, 2, 3, all those kind of discussions we could have in terms of some real sensitive price modelling. The last 3 years we've just been on hold. And last week we seemed to be told by a UK civil servant, well, actually, you could just have been getting on with this for the last 3 years. So I'm quite interested to know from Professor Timoney whether you think, and you have to be diplomatic in what you say, do you feel the lack of clarity from the UK government means we've wasted 3 years of our time waiting for something to emerge which is simply not going to emerge, and it's actually patients and health boards in Scotland that are going to suffer because of that?
I honestly can't answer that question because I don't know at what stage value-based pricing is at the present time. I think I need to be very clear, though. I think Katie Peters last week suggested that there'd been a lot of interaction with SMC, and I didn't recognise some of those statements. So SMC were involved. We had a meeting, as you say, VBP came out as consultation late 2010. We were invited to a meeting at St Andrew's House on 2nd of March 2011, which involved St Andrew's House and DH and SMC, really discussing the consultation. We had a teleconference about a month, 2 weeks after that, and we haven't had any other discussions with DH. We've been invited to the technical workshops that she referred to the workshops around burden of illness, wider societal values, therapeutic innovation. But those were technical workshops where basically people talked about the evidence, and it's a very conflicting evidence in some instances, and some of the technical challenges about trying to take into consideration what would be a wider societal benefit. There was no outcome from that workshop for us to say, okay, well, that's what it looks like. So I'm still waiting to see that.
Dr. McDonald.
Clearly, the negotiations are still ongoing between the relevant parties and the Department of Health, and I'm not party to that at all, but I've seen the consultation that came out at the beginning. I think maybe a key point that's causing this lack of clarity is simply value-based price, but which price? If it's the list price, and Angela has to some extent said this, if it's the list price, then a lot will have to change. But if it's the reimbursement price, then to some extent, the methods will be developed by NICE and the SMC as they see fit. So I think that's the key question. And until the negotiations finish, we won't know. But if it's the former, it's a big change. If it's the latter, it's much more devolved, and you can decide what's most appropriate for Scotland.
Yes.
So I think it's very difficult for anybody to speak with any authority on value-based pricing because nobody really knows kind of what is happening. But I think it's important to kind of get a few things straight, I guess. Is one is that VBP appears not necessarily to be a pricing mechanism connected to the PPRS, but part of a health technology assessment value assessment. And I think there's been a change in thinking, it appears, from the DH in England. When the consultation first came out, it seemed that it was very much a pricing mechanism attached to the PPRS. It has subsequently evolved to be something that NICE will do and will form part of a broader assessment of value. So these are two very different things. And as we know, pricing is a responsibility of the UK government, whereas the assessment of value is the responsibility of devolved nations. So I think what we need clarity about is VBP a mechanism of pricing attached to the PPRS, or is it an assessment of value mechanism? Now, if it's an assessment of value mechanism, then that should be a devolved responsibility that should give the SMC and the Scottish Government a bit of freedom to come up with a value-based price by whichever means it deems sensible and responsible for the best use of our NHS resources. And I think if we can clarify that point, and VBP is indeed an assessment of value mechanism rather than a pricing mechanism, it's devolved to Scotland, and it comes back to our earlier discussion. We need to sit down with the SMC and work out what can we do to improve methods to make sure that we can have a broader assessment of value and to have that all-important discussion about what is that price point that's acceptable to taxpayers, the NHS, patients and industry. And that's really what it comes down to.
A couple of issues, though, in terms of the evidence that we've had. You know, they've resolved this difficult situation of access because they put in place a drug cancers fund. So the people who are losing out are here in Scotland. It's all this is a debate that, that should take place and rightly takes place about getting that best value and best outcome for patients. But while that debate goes on, we've got a group of people here who are excluded from that. So there's an issue there. And there's another issue about the delay, I think, that is taking a session with this committee to discover that there's been a change in direction, or maybe been a change of direction within the UK Health Department about whether this is societal wider issues or as a pricing mechanism. So, you know, it doesn't augur well that we're disjointed from this process as we see now. You know, because this debate could go on for some considerable time with no discernible outcome for patients in Scotland. So what do we do in response to that? I mean, last week we had evidence that said, well, they're expecting the Drug Cancer Fund to finish in 2014. A final decision has not been taken on that. And indeed, those who have gained access to medicines will continue to receive those medicines beyond 2014. So it's people here that's disadvantaged by that with an expectation that everybody seems to think now is not going to bring us any real value or difference, or indeed we could have been getting on with it ourselves.
So I think we can't change what's happened over the last 2 or 3 years. I think that what we need to do now, on the basis of this very good discussion that we've had, not about IPTRs and all that stuff, but about the kind of crux of the matter on the back of the meeting with Katie Peters, it's very clear what the 2 or 3 issues are. And whether it's the SMC or whether it's the Scottish Government, we need to take by the scruff of the neck and go back to the DH England and seek clarification on these points. Because what we then want to do is to be in charge of our own destiny, as it were, in terms of the approval, the assessment and access to medicines. Because what we don't want to be in a position is whereby the divergence of access to medicines in England and Scotland widens in the short term because we've not understood how best to move forward. That would be worse than we are at the moment. And I think for me the path is quite clear. If we can get answers to these questions, then we need to come around the table again and work out with the clinicians, with the NHS, what is the best way forward for the SMC to have its methods adapted to allow a broader assessment of value consistent with the discussions that we're having, and have that all-important discussion about the price that's valuable. We then must have a mechanism whereby doctors have the freedom to prescribe the outcomes of that process in a way that they see best on behalf of the patients.
Mr. Webb?
So I certainly agree with our last speaker in terms of the need for clarity from Department of Health. That time's running out for them. The OFT reported some 5 or 6 years ago, and the idea was to make a value judgment through NICE, SMC, All Wales Medicine Strategy Group, acting together to determine which drugs created sufficient value for their market price, and for those that didn't satisfy the market price, there would then be a pricing unit that would negotiate with industry at arm's length from those organisations to set a price that did give value to the NHS. That was the original purpose. The Cancer Drug Fund was a stopgap to take us through to 2014 when this was all to happen. If it's going to happen, it's going to have to happen very soon. If it's not going to happen, then I agree we have to go our own way. But this is we're at just the wrong moment to make our own decisions about this, because we need to know what DH is going to do.
Drew Smith.
Thank you, Convener. People will be aware who followed the evidence last week that we did question the Department of Health quite closely on what their engagement with Scotland had been. So it is confusing to the committee that we've got to this stage where there seems to be so much confusion about it. So I wonder if we just have a bit more information, probably principally from the SMC, Professor Timney, around what was the structure of that engagement and who in your eyes was responsible for it. What did you see that it was the role of SMC to be keeping a watching? Because I understand you said that you didn't recognise some of the statements that DOH made about the engagement they were having with Scotland. So whose responsibility in Scotland was it to be understanding what was happening at Department for Health level?
SMC we're based in Scotland, and we report to the Scottish Government, so that's my route of communication, and it wouldn't be appropriate for me to directly contact DH, and I wouldn't do that. I would always go through ESG, and that's right. One of the statements that was made last week by Katie Peters, and I presume she just didn't understand that, but she said that SMC and NICE regularly meet about VBP. We have never had any formal or informal meetings with NICE around value-based pricing.
Have you requested those meetings through the Scottish Government, or you understood that the Scottish Government were making the points on that SMC would wish to make in relation to those discussions, or they just weren't happening?
Basically, Scottish Government, I think, it has to liaise with DH over what's happening with, because effectively with PPRS, the DH have the responsibility, and that's where it's been left at the present time. So we said Scottish Government, and presumably they're involved in those discussions.
When presumably SMC obviously responded to the initial consultation from DOH, what sort of things were you asking for then? Because presumably it would have become clear that in the course of what you'd asked for wasn't what appeared to be coming out.
Well, in terms of there was a public consultation, and we responded to that public consultation and raised some of the issues. I mean, some of our concerns was that a lot of the stuff in value-based pricing is motherhood and apple pie, and it was really how is this going to come out in reality? So we were trying to test some of the systems around how they're going to value burden of illness and so forth. And I think that's why we've been involved in the technical workshops, and I'm pleased for that. I understand there's now going to be a meeting between Scottish Government, DH, SMC and NICE, and I welcome that. I don't have a date for the meeting.
Could I just ask one other thing on SMC, if that's okay, Convener? And it goes back to the recommendations in the report, actually, and it's around this issue of where an assessment has not been made because the company haven't made a submission, and the recommendation that SMC could perhaps look at that independently itself based on the public information. How practical do you envisage that being?
It's pretty challenging, actually. I don't think you should underestimate the work pharmaceutical companies do when they submit to us. So to do a clinical and cost-effectiveness assessment requires us to build models, and we don't do that, and we critically appraise what the company submits. So we would need a significant additional resource to do that piece of work. But I understand why it's been suggested, because actually what we're getting back from the services, they would like that. They would like that perspective from SMC. I think there's a possibility that one of the reasons that's been suggested is it's thought that perhaps that might encourage the companies to put in their own submission rather than having SMC do it independently. So we absolutely could do it, but we would require significant additional resource to do that.
Paul Patterson.
Yes, in a similar line to my colleague Drew Smith raised. If my memory serves me right, in the very first session on this evidence taking on this issue, the issue of value-based pricing was raised, and I think the nearest thing we could describe, if it was on the public record, a shrug of the shoulders would be that response because no one knew anything about it. They didn't know how it would impact, and I think the reasoning given that it was based on price. And we've got quite a few knowledgeable people around this table, and I know that last week we fairly pushed Katie Peters with regards to consultation in Scotland. I think it's quite important that we put it on the public record today exactly who was consulted. And I think at the same time that the Minister said at the time had very little knowledge and very little feedback from the department. So I wonder if anyone would like to comment in that regard, if they have any knowledge of any other agencies in Scotland that were consulted.
Yes, Mr. Lowe.
So I think just to put the communication and lack of clarity on VBP into kind of context, that NICE attended the workshops that Professor Timoney attended on behalf of SMC, and they were equally in the dark as to not around the principles of VBP. I think everybody understands what VBP is and what it's trying to do. What we don't understand is how it's going to work in practice. So NICE were also in the dark at that stage. And even though subsequently NICE have been asked to do VBP, at the time of that announcement, NICE still didn't know what was kind of going on. So I think there's been an underlying lack of clarity, despite there being a consultation and workshops around some of the practical and implementable aspects of VBP. So it's not just something that the SMC have been subject to. We and other patient charities have been urging the Department of Health to speak to the SMC and the All Wales Group more proactively. And I think it's safe to say they have been relatively dismissive of that and saying, well, it's a matter for the SMC, it's a matter for the Scottish Government, which is consistent with Katie Peters' discussions last week. But I think it comes back, I don't think we should unpick what has happened, because we're all in the same boat. I think what's important is to establish a platform based on current evidence around how Scotland moves forward. And I think it is down to getting clarity around whether or not it's a pricing mechanism or an assessment of value, and what scope the Scottish Government has to embody the principles of VBP in SMC assessment, and the ability to have a discussion around price as part of an assessment of value. The launch price is something completely different that's a matter for Westminster Government. So I actually think we don't need to tie ourselves in knots around the complexity and the issues of what's happened in the past, because it will drive us completely mad. It's about taking it from this point forward with clarity about what we want to achieve in Scotland, getting the answers to what are some very simple questions from the Department of Health in England. On the basis of these answers, come back in and put a process and system in place that works for Scotland.
Dr. MacDonald. David Fly.
Just building again upon those prior comments, this may be seen as a slightly simplistic comment, and at one level it is, but do we really need to wait? Because in some form or other, the value question is going to come, and therefore couldn't some of that work be initiated before value-based pricing is totally on the table? Because be it on the list price or the reimbursement price, we still need to know what do Scots consider of value, and there's a societal aspect to that, for example. There is a social cost aspect, what's feasible. So I wonder if at least some of the initial thinking can start, even if we don't know the final answer.
I'll join it up, but it's just to go back to the non-submission question, just to give a board perspective, because Angela was commenting on that. I think as a board we would absolutely welcome SMC taking a proactive HTA approach to non-submission, but it will require resourcing, and as a board, as other boards who commit our clinicians and pharmacists to the SMC to undertake some of that work, acutely aware of the workloads involved. I think it fits with the transparency and consistency that you're trying to achieve and we're trying to achieve. I think it fits with the whole ethos of SMC in terms of reducing duplication of effort, if not process, but effort at a local level, because if we've got a non-submission, then we're still having to deal with that through IPTRs, etc. And importantly, it doesn't undermine the driver for pharma to submit, because I think what we don't want is things that disengage the industry from submitting. We've got to remember 30% of medicines are not submitted to SMC, and I've made comment here before about that. And I think if the company thinks it won't achieve an acceptable cost-effectiveness level, then I think the discussions that we had about joint working earlier on are a really powerful base from which to start. It's about how we can work with industry to either demonstrate the effectiveness that they've not been able to demonstrate up to that point. We have to remember we look at drugs very early in their lifespan. And so there's something about that, and something about maybe the targeting. Because if we can target to a more appropriate group of patients who we are much better, much clearer that they're going to respond, then effectiveness go up. Cost effectiveness will drop. You know, there are only several points in this where you can manipulate. We can either bring the cost down, we can improve the effectiveness or the targeting, or we can change our willingness to pay. And it's those three things that are in the mix, and we just need to remember that.
Professor Gourley.
Yeah, just one other thing, sort of add into this whole idea that, you know, if SMC was expanded and given more power to negotiate for us and help us access medicines, then it would also allow them potentially to reassess medicines when they come off patent. Because if a drug company put a medicine in, if they submit it to SMC and it's not approved, then eventually that medicine will come off patent. But according to the rules as they are just now, even though the medicine may become a lot cheaper, it still wouldn't be available in Scotland. And unless there's a process by which those medicines can be assessed at that point when their price changes and therefore their cost effectiveness changes, then, you know, that's not going to change. So this would all fit well if they were given more scope.
Drew Smith, I think you wanted to come back a wee bit to the...
Just very briefly, Convener, I just wanted to, in terms of where would the driver come from for these particular assessments to be taken forward in your view? Because the suggestion is that where NHS Scotland, you know, requests it. So is this based on the fact that there have been a number of IPTR requests, that this is based on, you know, clinicians in particular fields saying, I have an awareness of this and a group of us are concerned, this is coming from the boards? What would you see as being the drivers, and how does the voice of patients also fit into that?
I think it actually, although David said 30% of drugs are not submitted, it's really, these are usually just additional indications and not a brand new medicines. Most new medicines are submitted, but even for those that are not submitted, what we've done in the past, just to get a sense of that, is we've gone back out to the ADTCs, which is our constituency, and we've said, is this causing you a problem locally? And they're usually able to tell us, and they will link in with their local clinicians, these are medicines that we've not had a submission for. We've been challenged there in terms of how we can actually address that, but I think it would not be difficult to identify those medicines that were causing problems because the service didn't have an SMC view.
MacDonald and then Professor Webb.
Maybe I should try and say something on that point from the industry point of view. I'm sure industry would be happy to work to try and find solutions, particularly for the brand new medicines. But the issue, and I welcome what David said, the issue for many is it costs a lot of money to make the submission, and we've surveyed our members, and it can go anything from about 50,000 to over 200,000, depending on the complexity of the model. Now, that doesn't mean to say that NHS doesn't need it, but it does provide a bit of a disincentive for a company if they know they're going to get a no. So some of the prior discussions about value, etc., are relevant in this context. But clearly, if the NHS needs something, then obviously the industry will be willing to work and try and find some solution. But it is slightly easier said than done, and it is a wider context than just writing a document.
I'm not sure what the annual cost of SMC is at the moment, but I would suspect it's probably under £1 million. We're talking about an order of magnitude greater cost if you take on 20 or 30, just as you say. If you take on that role, you need to have the health technologist to do it. I'm not sure Scotland does, and you'd need to increase the money that goes to SMC to support its activities by at least an order of magnitude.
I think that's a really important
So effectively, SMC costs 1.2 million now, David, per year, and that's for 80 assessments a year. So each assessment costs approximately £12,500. The figures that Francis is talking about in terms of actually to prepare that model, anywhere between 50,000 and 200,000 is a huge amount of money. So the NHS needs to decide if it wishes to spend its money in that way to some extent. So we could do it, but it will be challenging. What I would also say is, though, that NICE would say that for them to do their single technology assessments costs them £160,000 per assessment. So it's not as if anyone else can do it more cheaply than in SMC.
Is there any other committee members? Jackie Bailey? Oh, sorry, Aileen.
Just a very small point I wanted to make, which was, sorry, Jackie. It was just around the issue about transparency, because, you know, we talk a lot about the need for having greater transparency, which would help to build more trust and confidence by the patients around the process. But I wondered what your kind of views were around the ideas about publishing all the clinical trials data, because that would be one way to try and get greater patient involvement and greater patient trust and confidence in the system.
Response on that, Mr. Lohan. And then.
So so that there's obviously lots of work going on around transparency of clinical trial data, but I think, with no disrespect to your average patient, they're not going to be able to interpret clinical trial data. I mean, it's hard enough for doctors to extrapolate some of the stuff that comes out of that. And I think that I'm all for greater transparency, but I think that's all around process, as we've discussed. I think it's not going to change. I mean, increase the confidence in SMC decisions. It may make them more visible, but I don't think it's going to change the decisions by any large amount. So I think with transparency, I think it's you know, not about the short pass or the long pass. It's just about being pragmatic and sensible about transparency. But it's more focused on the crux of the matter is what is the issue, and it's the issue that David sort of said right at the beginning. But I think patients should have access to clinical trial data.
MacDonald?
The Industry Association would agree that the clinical trials should be published. There have been guidance in place to make sure that the data is put on ClinTrials.gov, and it hasn't always been done on time, and it's similar to some of the discussions here. The industry has now put in place agreements to audit and encourage that, so it does actually happen. So there's no in principle disagreement that the results should be published.
We'll now move to Jackie Bailey. Jackie?
Thank you very much, Convener. I just want to take a step back because, you know, notwithstanding all the technical detail we've heard here, the message that's come across loud and clear is that we've got two very interesting reports, but they are essentially the recommendations about transparency and process and don't deal with the central issue of how you improve access to medicines. I've heard nothing that suggests that the IPTR process is going to improve to let more people in. So I keep coming back to the fundamental question of, you know, notwithstanding the SMC, you know, saying yes more often, and that will take time and it will take a different, I think, set of recommendations. I come back to the issue of fairness, which is we have patients who are considering moving to England to get access to medicines that you can't get here. And I'm wondering where in these set of recommendations is that issue going to be resolved? Or, I think somebody mentioned earlier that there is the potential of saving £300 million on our drugs budget. Could some of that be pressed into play? And I just wonder if somebody was to offer a solution on how we resolve the issue of the unfairness that's in the system, what would that be?
So I think that's right, and I think that's what we've actually been discussing. Is how do we make the SMC methods give more yeses, less dependency in IPTRs, but at a price that represents value, which is key. And some of the divergence between Scotland and England is they have slightly different mechanisms around getting to that point because of the CDF, etc., etc. And I think what we're saying is that we need to, from this point onwards, come up with our own solution that's not the CDF. It's another mechanism. And I think we're all saying the same thing. I think we just need to get to the point. Let's have the discussion. Let's get round the table and let's have it, because we can't have a widening of access between Scotland and England. That would be terrible. So let's get on and have the discussion.
Anyone else? Yeah, Professor Gourley.
Yeah, just totally back that up. You know, we're clearly in a situation here where there is a big disparity, particularly with regard to cancer medicines. But, you know, I don't think the creation of a cancer drugs fund is necessarily the best solution. I think this whole idea of finding a Scottish-specific solution that's fair for all conditions, you know, but it needs flexibility, and SMC, or which, if it's an organisation that sits outside of SMC that's going to do this negotiation with pharma and going to, you know, try and get the best possible value, then, you know, the other thing is that we need more flexibility. You know, the SMC are to a certain extent hamstrung by rules, you know, and there was a good example recently when we had a drug for ovarian cancer where we wanted, the clinicians in Scotland had done a big clinical trial using half the licensed dose, and it may have made the drug cost effective, but SMC could not assess that dose because it's only allowed to assess licensed medications. What I would like to see is them given the remit to speak to the clinicians in Scotland and be allowed to have that flexibility. So rather than a sort of a fund that sits outside of everything like the Cancer Drugs Fund, which patients with non-cancer conditions could consider to be very unfair, then we should have a sort of more global solution. But we need to start working for it just now. And right at this point in time, there is a big disparity. And patients who have got diseases now that they want to get these drugs for are talking about moving south of the border.
So any other, I'm going to try and get some of the witnesses. I'm going to allow Jackie to come back in. Professor Timoney. Professor Timoney.
Sorry, yeah, just on your point about the 300 million efficiency savings, I think you need to be really clear that the NHS is spending more money on drugs now than it did last year or the year before, and that 300 million is tended to go towards paying for increased volume of medicines for mostly older people. So there's not as if there's a pot of money to use for cancer medicines, because we're actually spending more on medicines this year than we did last year and the year before. And that's right, and that's an appropriate way to treat the patients.
Yes, Melinda.
Just a question, observation here. We get value-based pricing. We don't have the disparity between the north and the south. We're still going to have medicines which aren't going to be funded. So I suppose the question then is, what is the Scottish Government going to do to manage that expectation of the Scottish population? And that, you might not have answers to that today, but it's certainly, don't want to be back here again in about 3 years' time discussing the same issues that we've hung our peg on value-based pricing, but we're still going to have that expectation that there's going to be medicines out there that patients will want, that that system will also find which aren't cost-effective.
Did you have the supplementary to some of that discussion?
Yes, and thanks, Convener. As a recent member just rejoined this committee and came in maybe slightly late in the debate, but I'd like to know Professor Angela Timoney's comments in regards to hamstrung by rules. Should you meet in public? Should you invite manufacturers of new medicines to give evidence? Should you explore other innovative approaches? You know, SMC, I've sat here listening, SMC is continually getting criticised. You quite rightly pointed out that £300 million that was saved has to be spent everywhere else. And the point that's just come on to me as a layman, value, pricing is that the drug would come in here at a decent price, that we could afford it, that we could then give it to our constituents or patients or whatever, And that's where it comes down to. No disrespect to any drug company. They spend billions on developing a drug, and some work and some don't. And I feel that, they may want to recoup the price. I note that we are cheaper in Scotland than what it is abroad. But the factor is, you know, value-based pricing to me as a layman is that my constituents can get the drug that they require at a decent price, and that we are not getting overcharged by drug companies. But I'd be very interested in Professor Timoney's reply to the comments I've made, because I think SMC is continually getting battered unduly.
Actually, I don't think I share your views. I was really pleased by the Routledge report and by the comments I've heard around this committee and from consultants and others about the high quality nature of our work, about the international reputation, the comments from speakers from abroad who basically say they look to see what SMC says. But I understand this is really difficult. It's very difficult if you say no. And people don't want to say no. Mostly what I hear is people talking about how often SMC says yes. Somewhere or other it has to be. People have to say it's okay to say no because this is not a fair price for the NHS. The industry are entitled to charge the prices that they want to charge to make the profits that they require to make. But somebody or other needs to say, actually, that's more than we're prepared to pay. And that's why, and that's a tough job. And we take that seriously. And around the committee, those are very difficult judgments based on the evidence before us. And every single one of my committee members is thinking about the patients that they see day in, day out, and making that decision. And Frances is a member of that committee, and she will acknowledge it, that none of the decisions, every time we say no, we tease out that evidence to see if we can find a way to say yes. But actually, at the end of the day, we say, I'm sorry, this is not value for money, and we stand by the decisions that we make. So I don't think we're hamstrung by rules, but I think it is important that we have rules, because we have to treat every drug in the same way, and we have to treat every patient and give them the same chance. There's equity there. In terms of meeting in public, I'm very happy to meet in public. My concern about meeting in public is that with patient access schemes, those prices are confidential. And the most controversial decisions that we make tend to be those associated with drugs that have got patient access scheme. And I'm really concerned that we'll be asked to meet in public, and for the particular drugs that are really controversial, that's when we're going to say, well, actually, you need to leave the room. And that we'll get criticised for that, when in fact it's a commercial issue.
Just a small comeback.
Well,
very small comeback.
I'll indulge you, Richard, but it was Jackie,
yes.
know, in the forum of the committee.
Yeah, well, you know, the small comeback is, who decides the price of a medicine? Is it the drug company, and or do you have a say? Or they just say, right, it's going to cost X, and you have to say, well, we're not prepared to pay that?
So there's free pricing at the point of launch. That's what happens. SMC have absolutely no role whatsoever to negotiate price. We are not able to do that. We simply assess the price. We assess the submission that's made to us.
Should you?
Well, we can't, because that's part of PPRS. Pricing is a reserved matter.
I knew the answer before the question.
If we had time, it would be nice to have the conversation, but we need to press on. Jackie Bailey for
just a tiny thing, and you know, I accept SMC operate by a set of rules that they're given, but it strikes me that what we have is two reports into the wrong issues, and actually the discussion you want to have is being had round this table, and hopefully the Cabinet Secretary will reflect on that, because I know he does certainly pay close attention to what the committee's been saying. But in the period it will take to get there, what do we do now?
In the meantime,
for the patients that are making life-changing decisions, what do we do now?
So, yes, no.
From an NHS perspective, we have been given these rules and regulations to follow, and if the SMC decision is not recommended, then unfortunately the only avenue that we have there is the IPTR route. So unless something is to change with that, there is no other way that we can treat that. Obviously you have the Rare Medicines Fund now, which will be issuing their guidance on that. But even within that process, it still needs to go through that IPTR or the group process in order to achieve. And the onus there is to show how is that person going to be different than the population which was assessed. And I think a lot of the issues which has led to some of the things which why we're here today is the misconception that the IPTR route was a means for to access the medicine regardless, and that is not the case.
Anyone else? Professor Webb.
I certainly don't have an answer. I'm not sure anyone does in this room, but what I would say is that SMC has functioned very effectively for the last 12 or 13 years, and I think any short-term measures that were put in place that destabilise the activity of SMC would be very harmful. So I think it's very difficult to put in a stopgap. The Cancer Drug Fund hasn't worked tremendously effectively either, and I don't think that will be renewed. So I would just guard against making short-term changes and maybe deal with this head-on.
I do agree with those comments. I guess the only thing is that there is still this inequity, and there's a period of time here where it's extremely distressing for patients, and you know, there's already been a fund created in Scotland, the Rare Conditions Fund, so the problem with that is that it's only good for rare conditions, and a lot of the patients we want to treat have got common conditions, you know, and so, you know, I can't think of anything more, you know, more palatable than just a stopgap fund, but obviously that's very controversial.
No one else? Lee?
I have a concern that the Cancer Drugs Fund, if anything, stymied and muddied the water, because it meant that the companies got the price that they wanted from England, which made us look bad, made us look mean about it. And it might have been better if they hadn't done that, but we can't change that now. The patient access scheme, where companies can go with a better price, we wouldn't have that if it were not possible, if drug companies weren't using that system. And I have been cross with companies who have had products for melanoma patients and haven't gone with a better price. People who say, there's nothing more we can do, the SMC say, no, we've got no more information. Well, that's rubbish. You can drop your price to a price which is agreeable. Yes, your drug may be effective, and yes, we're on balance under the circumstances, it's reasonably safe, but your price is off the wall. And you know, you're not going to sell this product in Scotland until you drop your price. So we've got to have a place for that negotiation to take place. We want their drug, but we're not prepared as patients to be held to ransom.
Dr. MacDonald.
Oh dear.
I've got you.
I think the SMC also does an excellent job, and you need systems that have, you know, balances within the system. But I think we do also have to remember the context. It does cost a lot to develop the medicines, and the PPRS does control the profit within the UK, and there have been a lot of redundancies also in the pharmaceutical industry. So I think one has to temper one's comments about the industry, and hopefully we're developing a lot of medicines that meet a lot of needs, which is to some extent why we have the discussion. So I think there is a balance on the pharmaceutical industry side as well.
Professor Timoney.
On that point to some extent, I want to make the point that, because a lot of this is about what SMC have said no to, and I think it's really important to remember some of the things that SMC have said yes to. So in my time since I've been chair of SMC, we said yes to the drugs for hepatitis C. Hepatitis C is a major public health issue. The drugs were actually incredibly expensive, but also incredibly beneficial. So the estimated cost to NHS Scotland for the Hep C drugs is £50 million at year 5. We also said yes to all of the new oral anticoagulant medicines, which will prevent stroke in patients. 3 new drugs, we said yes to all of them first time, and the costs are estimated to be about £20 million at year 5. That's £70 million for 2 sets of drugs. So we do say yes, and we are prepared to pay a high price for medicines where there is great benefits. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of that, because to some extent it seems to be that people think that all of the medicines have benefits and it's because of the cost. It's not. Where the cost and the benefit are clear, SMC, even though we might be causing an affordability problem for the NHS, that's an awful lot of money for the NHS to find, we still say yes to that because it's the right thing for patients.
David Flay.
Colin, it'd be very, very easy to say, yes, bring on a cancer drug fund or bring on any fund that will fund all of the drugs which we've deemed not cost effective. Because it would take a lot of issues out of the system. But the question is affordability, value for money, and And often, I think we need to remember at the moment in Scotland, boards are carrying that onus of trying to demonstrate the value for money for the silent majority of the population within the board against using medicines for an individual patient through the IPTR request. And they're doing that task and trying to do the best they can with that. Simply what the Cancer Drugs Fund has done down south is take that all away and basically say, we'll pay for these non-cost effective medicines. And I think we also need to remember the issue of equity. The clue is in the title. It's the Cancer Drugs Fund. What about all the other conditions where there are non-cost effective medicines? So I think if before any response is made, I would like to see something which addresses that equity issue as well. Cancer, yes, very emotive, very media friendly. Lots of other conditions out there with non-cost effective treatments that patients feel that they need access to. And so there's a need to address across the piece. Thank you.
So the Cancer Drugs Fund is routinely funding non-cost effective drugs.
Yes.
Yeah. On that model, on the quality model. How much, does anybody know how much we've spent in the Cancer Drug Fund? And has it been fully utilised? Or?
It's 500 million, I think, and it hasn't been fully utilised.
But they've solved the problem.
No.
Pages of the newspapers, is that solving the problem?
Is that not what the recent announcement about the Rare Conditions Fund did as well?
You could say that, Convener, but I don't think they could answer.
Bob Doris and Drew Smith.
Thank you, Convener, for bringing me in just at that point. Can I, before I go into my substantive, and it's partly a point and partly a question, but first of all, in terms of these two reports we have before us, from Professor Scott and Professor Routledge, I think these do actually flow, I would say to Ms Bailey, in terms of a lot of the work of the committee, particularly around rare and orphan conditions, and particularly around the transparency of the SMC process. Now, whether or not they then reach the parts in terms of the overall view of access to new medicines, I think that's a reasonable discussion to have, but I don't think we should diminish the fact that these reports are in part a direct response to the diligent work of this committee and the petitioners that actually came to this committee through the Petitions Committee. I think it's very, very important to put that on the record. We've also heard about a cancer drugs fund, and I sometimes think this is viewed in isolation in terms of how a society or how the NHS deals with the money that we spend on cancer or any other life-limiting or terminal conditions. And also in saying, Convener, and what I'm about to say is that I don't think any politician, when the SMC and IPTRs have said no to an individual who has cancer and whose family are with that individual and love that individual who has cancer, I don't think any explanation we give will ever cut it to those individuals and families, and I think we just have to accept that no matter what rules we have in place and no matter whatever new rules we have in place, there'll always be a situation where an individual and a family is told no, irrespective of how we change the system, and no family, I think, will particularly be appeased irrespective of what set of rules we have in place if they're if they're dealing with that directly and the heartache and the pain that causes. But back to cancer, I sometimes think when we mention the Cancer Drugs Fund that we forget about work in terms of cancer prevention, in terms of cancer early detection, in terms of curative attempts in cancer, and we go to an end of life aspect of cancer and how distressing that is for families. And I sometimes think we miss the bigger picture, and unfortunately the bigger picture does sometimes have to take emotion out of the equation, which is a horrible thing to say as a politician when I get these things at my surgery on a weekly basis, and rely on evidence. I therefore, my question is, in terms of evidence and how we treat any end-of-life condition, in terms of the Cancer Drugs Fund, is there any evidence that the Cancer Drugs Fund is in any way equitable in terms of how those patients who receive access to the Cancer Drugs Fund are treated compared to other patients that have end-of-life conditions, or indeed a whole myriad of other patients that have life-limiting or seriously damage the quality of their life otherwise if they don't receive a drug deemed cost-effective otherwise. So where is the equity in terms of a cancer drugs fund, in terms of treating all patients with heart-rendering, sensitive stories to tell and the stress it puts on those individual patients and families? How does the Cancer Drugs Fund create an equitable basis to deal with all patients?
So responses, brief response. We've got 5 minutes. We're half an hour, running on half an hour. So, Mr. Lowe.
It seems to me we're taking a backward step in the discussion about the kind of cancer drugs. I think we've all decided that it's not the way forward. I think England have realised it's not the way forward. It's not the solution, and I question whether we use our time to backtrack and discuss the Cancer Drugs Fund. I think the previous discussions have set the path out very clearly about what the issues are. We're all united in that, and that's what we have to focus on. There's a willingness around the table from industry, from MSPs, from SMC, from clinicians and patient groups to find a solution to our problems. We're all willing to work to find solutions, and it has to be fair for all. It's going to be fair for industry, it's going to be fair for the NHS, taxpayers, patients and clinicians. That has got to be our focus. I see no point in talking about cancer drugs funds and IPTRs. It's not the solution to the problem that we've discussed, and it will just take away the clarity that I think we reached half an hour ago in the discussion. And I think all our efforts need to be focused in on finding our solution to our problem in a way that everybody gets out of it what they need.
See a lot of nodding around the table. And the purpose of the time, is that the general agreement to that? Yes. Thank you. Drew Smith, I think you've got a final question.
Very briefly, Convener, I may not get an answer to it, and it perhaps leads us into the next session, but I suppose it goes back to Jackie Bailey's points about what the questions that these two reviews and the reports from them answer, and trying to be focused around the wishes of the petitioners where we started, but also the evidence that we heard. And one of the pieces of evidence that we heard that was very concerning to us was the issue around clinicians and their experience of clinical practice, and also the issue of clinical research as a result of where we are on drugs in Scotland. Now, there isn't a lot in these reports, there aren't a lot of recommendations around it in these reports, and we may hear more of it in the next session, but I wanted to give the opportunity, particularly to the health boards, to say, well, are there recommendations here that you think begin to answer some of those questions, or does your position remain that those concerns are overblown? And therefore that we don't need to have recommendations around them, because otherwise, if the suggestion is that we need to have further work around value in the process, does the issue also remain that we actually need to do further work around the whole issue of clinical practice and clinical research?
Mr. Goodley.
In terms of clinical research, I mean, the report suggests that access to latest clinical trials isn't being restricted by the inability to access drugs that are now regarded as international standard of care. And the rationale given in the report for that statement was that commercial studies the number of commercial studies in Scotland have not decreased since 2010. However, the report does state that the number of big phase 3 studies has gone down. Now, there is absolutely no doubt that there are a number of examples of clinical studies that cannot be done in Scotland because we cannot provide what is regarded internationally as the standard of care, because we cannot provide the standard drugs. So if you introduce a trial, you're testing a new drug, but you're testing it against the standard, and we cannot access the standard. And the point I would make is that by the time that shows up in your clinical trial activity data, you will have lost your position at the forefront of clinical research. And that's really important for Scotland. So, the clinical research and the trials issue is a massive one. And it's also a massive one for patients, because patients who get onto clinical trials benefit from those clinical trials.
Any other comment, response on that? Lee?
I was concerned about that, the fact that our phase 1 and phase 2 trials are standing, but we're losing out in phase 3 trials. And I found that almost quite objectionable. It means that our patients are being used as guinea pigs for fairly untried stuff and not getting the benefit of the phase 3 trials, by which time we know the dose, we know so much more about the drug. And that really is very worrying. I don't have an answer to it, but it's very worrying.
Yes, David.
I just think within that there's the need to tease out some of the issues about the cost of running those phase 3 trials and where we, where we become less cost effective, less cheap in a sense for industry to do that. And I think some of the discussions that we had earlier on about post-marketing studies may resolve some of the issues you're describing. And if you like, make up for some of that, it being more expensive to do those phase 3 trials here. So I think there are other solutions maybe that might help that, rather than just the access of the drug at the point of licensing. If that makes sense.
Professor Gourley?
It's also worth pointing out that the relationship with pharma and big international phase 3 studies bring a lot of income into Scotland, and so, you know, it could be that that's another point of negotiation. Some clinical trials actually save the NHS money, so they are mechanisms that we use as clinicians to access drugs that we can't access routinely. If there's a clinical trial that we can do that uses that drug, so that has to be thrown into the equation as well.
Can I bring this? Yeah, yes, please, yes.
I was just going to come back and just back that up, because it's absolutely clear that we do make savings in terms of that trial activity, specifically around medicines, let alone anything else. So it's just to back that comment.
I'm going to bring the session to a close now. Can I thank you all very much for the time that you've given us this morning, and indeed throughout this inquiry. I think the message that we get here, there are a number of issues still unresolved with the review and its conclusions, but there's a lot of goodwill here to create a better situation. Thank you all very, very much for your attendance. Suspend at this point while we change round the panel. Thanks. Welcome everyone, and we now move to our second panel. And I propose to do as we did with the first. I'm not going to ask everybody to introduce themselves at this point. I think many of us know one another, but we may want to, I didn't press that in the first session, but we may want to introduce ourselves if we make a contribution. I think that would just cut down on the time. We'll go directly to questions, and our first question is from Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Convener. I think with this second session, I'm very impressed with a number of doctors and people who are actually at the hard end of this disease, which unfortunately is with us and can come in many forms, but you know, it's the big C word. Many of our witnesses have sat during the first session, and I'd be very interested to know what they have learned from it, what they would suggest that we, if they have anything which they would like to tell us in regards to maybe sitting in the background there and they wanted to suddenly put their hand up and reply, and also how do they feel about the SMC?
It's a free-ranging question that should invite someone in. I think we can all, from the first session, I think there was a lot of agreement on many of the issues, and we don't know whether that agreement continues or whether your own contributions or thoughts would contribute to that process. In terms of the review then, what was your response to the review? Do you believe that, as many of the first panel thought that, it was well-meaning, that it made some good proposals in terms of openness and transparency, but it didn't get to the heart of the matter? Thank you, Leslie.
I might as well kick off. I'm a patient with the ultra-orphan bone marrow disease, paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria, or PNH for short. I represent PNH Scotland, the charity PNH Scotland, and also the UK-based organisation PNH Alliance. We absolutely welcome the report. We completely concur that the SMC is internationally recognised as being excellent. However, we have an issue, as did the report, with its dealings with ultra-orphan diseases, and that is one area that we particularly were very grateful that the report acknowledged the term ultra-orphan. This is something that you'll probably remember that we've been asking to be recognised for quite some time. Really, though, on the whole, from our point of view, we're interested in the IPTR system and the Rare Conditions Medicine Fund and the issues that are still surrounding that I feel that weren't necessarily brought out in the report.
Anyone else? Good. Ian McKen.
My name is Ian McKerson. I represent... My name is Ian McKerson. I represent AHUS UK, a charity and support group for patients with atypical hemolytic uremic syndrome in the UK and their families. It's an ultra-rare disease. We think there are about 20 to 25 patients with AHUS in Scotland. So my interest is in ultra-orphan drugs and orphan drugs in the UK, and I have a particular interest in access to a monoclonal antibody called eculizumab for the treatment of AHUS. Our general view of the report was that it was well-researched, well-argued and well-written, and where it relates to the areas that are of concern to us, we thought the recommendations were very useful, particularly Mr. Routledge's recommendation 5 on page 25 that SMC should develop a policy to guide the process of consideration of available evidence relevant to its advice on ultra-orphan medicines. No such thing has existed before, and ultra-orphan medicines have struggled to get past SMC in the past. So we regard this as a positive move. We also support and strongly support Professor Swainson's recommendation 12 that the RCMF concentrates on funding access to medicines for ultra-orphan diseases. And if administered independently in the way he suggests, we think will give fair consideration to ultra-orphan drugs, which SMC does not recommend. The idea of a group PTR, whilst somewhat vaguely expressed in the report, seems to contribute to the funding of drugs which have not got past the SMC. So our general position, where it relates to our interests, is it is most welcome.
I'm a consultant at the Beats and West of Scotland Cancer Centre. I think that the SMC report was fair. I think that all the consultants that I work with understand the complexity of the situation and are sensitive to the fact that all these drugs are expensive, and we have to look at cost effectiveness. So I think that was fair. I think transparency is always a good thing. I think that the IPTR report was really very disappointing and basically does not change my practice at all, and I think that we are still in the same situation as we were in before the report was published, in that we have a very difficult situation, our system to navigate, and I don't think it's going to bring any greater access to medicines that either have not been through SMC or have been turned down by SMC.
Anyone else? Yes.
From the Rare Disease UK perspective, I think I would wholeheartedly agree with everything that's just been said before. This report, whilst completely welcome and does bring forward some very good recommendations, particularly with regards to the SMC policy on ultra-orphans, there is some glaring omissions within this, and the IPTR issue is one that we would like to make sure is addressed going forward, because from this review there will be no change. Rare disease patients will still not be able to access medicines, even though there is now a fund in place. So this is something I think our committee will need to take forward.
Yes, Vicky.
Vicky Crowley from Cancer Research UK. I think I would definitely agree with the discussion that was had during the first session, which is that in the areas that the reports focus on, so looking at making sure that the system is equitable, is evidence-based, is transparent, most of the recommendations are very welcome, and some of them will be incredibly helpful in terms of improving public awareness, understanding and trust in the systems. But I would also agree with what's been said about the fact that actually there's not very much in these reports that will increase access, and that is almost a separate discussion. There are, I suppose, some particular points in terms of some of the recommendations that we would want to flag up as well, but I can come back to those.
Anyone else want to add to that? Or is that yes, Dr. Casal.
Point, I think it's addressed the ultra-orphan situation, I think, extremely well, but it hasn't taken us desperately far forward in how we manage our cancer patients for whom there are drugs that are currently not recommended.
Angus Long-Term Condition Support Groups. I think the report is in whole good recommendations, but yes, the IPTR system does need to be looked at. Also, from information I've had given to me, that there's still going to be a long term from IPTR and SMC getting information to the health boards and for the process of IPTR. And I feel it's quite difficult for a person with a long-term condition to go through that process and have a long time to wait to get the yes or the no answer on the IPTR.
Yes, John Fletcher.
Hi, I'm John Fletcher. I'm here to represent the AGSD, which is a group which also covers patient support group, which covers Pompe disease. We were one of the original petitioners, along with PNH and Rare Disease, and we very much welcome all the work that the committee has done, and I agree and echo as respect from the SMC that we're quite happy that they're going to take this, further, and the transparency that they've spoke about, and we very much welcome that. But we feel, even though the discussions have been around the individual patient treatment requests, we still feel as though we've got a stumbling block in that area, in the fact of trying to prove exceptionality. We believe that the drug that is used for Pompe disease, the enzyme replacement therapy, is effective. It's very expensive, and we're aware of that, but it has been proved that it's been effective, and we don't see how by proving exceptionality is going to, saying that our patients are different than the patients that were on the trial, is going to make any difference, because we say, why should we prove exceptionality when we say that the drug works? So why should the patients that we want to use it for be any different to the patients that was used for when the drug was used in the trials? So
is this apprehension born of reality of real-life cases that have tested the system, or can you test the system at this point, or is it from your expectation that nothing has changed? Yes.
The IPCR system, as it stands, and as it still is within the report, is based on, as Joan said, exceptionality. And for my own situation, there are 12 patients in Scotland who are recommended for my condition to be on my drug. 3 of them still require funding. It's almost impossible to prove exceptionality within such a tiny, tiny patient cohort. And as I understand it, there was only 1 person on the drug trial, so it's very difficult to be different from that. Yeah. So we can't get through the IPTR system. I mean, Alec Neil, the health minister, was on the radio yesterday stating that the IPTRs are based entirely on clinical effectiveness and not cost. However, for my own drug, it is very well documented, the eculizumab is very well documented to be 100% effective for patients who are recommended to go on it, giving a normal life expectancy back to patients like myself, therefore giving immense benefits. However, the patients are turned down both at initial IPTR hearing and then at the appeal level. A patient contacted me yesterday to say that she was turned down, she's been through appeal, she's waiting to hear. In both times, the drug was deemed to be clinically effective, but it was still turned down at the first hearing. So I'm not understanding where that disconnect is.
Anyone else got recent experience? No? Yes?
Talk about it a little bit. We discussed that very drug recently at IPTR, and at the IPTR level, where there is middle management representation, senior clinician representation, we agreed that the drug is effective. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But the group that met and discussed it were very reluctant to give agreement to go ahead with prescription of that drug just because of the sheer cost. And we agreed, because we have an established appeals process, that it should go to appeal, and that decision, because of the cost level, be made by, as it happens, the medical director in Tayside. So it was the sheer cost that the group were just nervous about letting it through.
My slight issue is that we seem to have a disconnect then with the way the government are portraying this as not cost entirely clinically effective reasons, and then what the health boards themselves are feeling, and I understand that feeling of, my goodness, the cost. I understand it. The problem is we have that disconnect, and that's where I think patients are finding it very difficult to understand and to cope.
The magnitude of the cost, though, is it? I don't know if people are aware of a year's treatment of eculizumab is $250,000. So we're talking up there, not, which was why a local group was nervous about passing it.
Joan Fletcher?
Can I just add to that? I think we also, we talk about transparency, and we totally appreciate and welcome that. We also welcome transparency towards the patients and the opinion that the patients are having the reasons why they're being turned down. I can fully understand that there is a limited amount of money, and we accept that, and we accept that not all drugs, and they've got to be some kind of cost effectiveness, but it's being portrayed to the patients that they are not getting the drug because of the cost. And in fact, one of our patients was actually in the letter that from when she was on her appeal, when she was turned down again, it was actually said, and it was quoted in the letter, may I quote from the letter that she had, that her appeal had been turned down or in the impact of the quality cost and subsequently on the opportunity cost implications for the NHS, Ursula and Aaron. And that was actually in the letter that was sent to the patient that she was turned down because, stating that she was turned down because of the cost implications that it would have on her trust or her health board. So when Alex Neil is saying that it isn't on cost, it is on clinical effectiveness, that is not transparent to the patients.
So, in these circumstances then, if we all accept that cost is an issue, and we accept that there's got to be good value for the patient and the National Health Service, so how could we make it better then? You know, how could this process be better? Or should the transparency come at the point, no, we've got a budget for prescribing and, you know, we've simply not got the money to do it? Yes, Leslie.
I think that would be fine if we weren't looking at the fact of inequalities even between health boards, and it isn't equal. I'd say this with great reservation, but I'd sooner none of us got the drug than some of us, you know, cherry-picked in and out, and it's clinically effective, so it's not that some people it would work for and some it wouldn't. I think that's a real issue.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I come back to well, as I said the last time, I mean, this issue really wouldn't have arisen if we didn't have a cancer drugs fund in England, because when I first became a consultant, none of these drugs were, well, none of the drugs that I deal with were being offered across the UK, and so therefore it wasn't coming up in the clinics. And it probably would have done, and that would have evolved, and it would have gone through SMC and etc. And then the way to then access these drugs was to go through the IPTR, and people have said that there is exceptionality, but exceptionality has now come out of the IPTR, and basically what they're asking us to do now is to ensure that the patient that we're requesting the drug for is different to the trial population, okay? And you have to also demonstrate that they're going to do better than the trial population. So this is asking the clinicians to come out of the evidence base that's already there and try and put forward scraps of evidence that might make them different on a clinical ground only. That's the only way they want it now, is on a clinical ground. There is a section that patients are supposed to put forward a statement. To me, I think that's now just cruel, because what does that add? Because Alex Neil said it's on clinical grounds. With a drug for 12 patients in Scotland, it's going to be impossible to try and tease out both of these points, try and tease out somebody who's different to the trial population and is more likely to benefit. And even when you do, my experience has been that the drug is still turned down. So I don't know where you go from here, but the IPTR process is not functioning as it should do. And I think that you have the decision making, and I agree it comes down to cost, but one of the comments in the report was that, you know, a lot of the doctors didn't understand the process, which I agree is probably true, and that somehow we should be able to seek advice from the specialists. Well, we, with all due respect, we are the specialists. We know the patient, we know the condition, we know the literature, yet we're able to put forward the data, but we're not then involved in the decision-making process. The decision-making process is then taken out of our hands and is taken over by management, and I think that's wrong. We should definitely be sitting at the table helping make the decision.
Thank you, Creighton. Yes, George.
Going back to the discussion in the previous session, I think there are clearly some issues in terms of the way that IPTRs are operating that need to be improved, but actually it's not about making an ideal IPTR system, because that's never actually going to provide population-based access for patients. It's by definition designed to provide access to a small number of unusual patients, and actually while we need to improve that system for those patients, we actually need to be going and looking back at the approval system at SMC level and saying, is there something that we can be doing there that will improve the situation so that people are not having to go through IPTRs, so that we're not seeing that as the answer, because it's never going to be the answer. And so that wider debate around the idea of value at SMC level and looking at those processes, I think in terms of improving the system for the vast majority of patients is where we should be focusing our efforts.
Lord Findlay.
Dr. Harrow's evidence, yes, I would agree that you should be there to support the application for the patient in IPTR in the management system, because yes, it will come down to cost, as we've heard, but if there's no one speaking physically for the patient, it will come against that every time. And what happens if there's an ultra-orphan drug that you can't provide specific exceptions? Where does it go? It doesn't go anywhere. It's refused funding. I think that's really sad for ultra-orphans.
Bruce Smith, the second question.
Just still on that, Convener, if I could, I mean, is people's view then that process should be, how would you create more clinical involvement in that decision making in those cases, particularly for the orphan drugs? Would it be simply around, how do you involve clinicians in the processes that already exist, or do people feel that actually that there is a need for a new process, and it would be that the judgment would be made by a clinician in another health board area, for example, looking at the situation that you've got, and solely making a clinical judgment and separating the cost issues and the clinical judgments entirely? I mean, is that people's view of where we need to be, or is that a step too far?
Leslie?
I feel that from the point of view of ultra-orphan conditions, the issue is that although I absolutely accept that for conditions like cancer, you will have amazing experts in many, many regions. I have one expert for Scotland, and I feel that the IPTR process does need to have, as was recommended in the report, a sort of a body of recognised experts, whether they be in Scotland or perhaps further afield if we have to, that patients would have the benefit of that exceptional knowledge that you need to have for these rare conditions. Things like, because obviously my drug, I know how expensive it is, and I'm incredibly grateful to have it, and I'm incredibly grateful to have a life now and not be having to claim any benefits or anything like that. What I would like to think is that an extreme specialist in an ultra-orphan condition would be able to bring to an IPTR or even an SMC hearing the understanding of the cost offsets, because in my case, I no longer am facing, the blood transfusions every 6 weeks, kidney dialysis, or any of these things that are cost offsets. It is an exceptionally expensive drug, but there are many, many things that I now am not going to be a burden on society for.
Yes.
Referring to how you assess ultra-orphan medicines, there was a perfectly good system in England until very recently called the Advisory Group for National Specialised Services, which was disbanded in March, and the HTA role for orphan drugs was given back to NICE, which is presently undertaking a full review to develop a policy and process for making decisions about how these drugs are dealt with. So if anybody were looking for a model on which to base assessment of rare and ultra-rare diseases, then Agnes would be the place to look. However, as I mentioned, it has been disbanded. And to take up one other point about cooperation among the home nations, Access to ultra-orphan drugs is currently under detailed review in 3 of the 4 home nations. And I have to ask, is there not a case for real cooperation among the health departments in Scotland, England and Wales to find a common definition, a common assessment policy and a common HTA process for orphan and ultra-orphan drugs? Surely, too, if that were to take place, then negotiations with pharma would be easier and certainly improve the negotiating position of the smaller nations. Until that happens, though, the divergence and the disparity between the way ultra-orphan conditions are dealt with in England, Wales and Scotland is likely to continue.
That process was you know, a theme earlier, and it was being suggested that we've got require resource, but we have got within our own hands, you know, in many of the areas, maybe not in the rare orphan diseases, that we've got a capability of moving on with some of this work, recognising that the SMC and the confines of their remit would need to be broadened, and recognise that it has been difficult with value-based pricing, you know, at this point to keep a pace about what's happening down south, or indeed if anything's happening down south, would that be, you know, a view that would be echoed among any of you here in terms of how we improve access to get more yeses, as someone described earlier? No view? Yep, Dr. Harrow, thank you.
I mean, the drug that I'm keen to use has not been submitted to SMC because it was part of a multiple technologies assessment by NICE. And so NICE decided that this drug, along with 2 other drugs that they took upon themselves to review, were not cost effective. And so therefore the drug company then is not going to submit to SMC because it's already been turned down by NICE. And NICE is the English equivalent of the SMC, but when they do a multiple technology assessment, my understanding is that that then applies to Scotland. So I'm in a situation whereby in England, NICE turned the drug down, but the English patients can get the drug through the Cancer Drugs Fund, but in Scotland, it's not going to be put through the SMC, but I am bound by the English NICE recommendation, and I can't navigate around that. And when I have tried to navigate around that through in an IPTR process, we as a team of consultants, colorectal cancer consultants, all sign, or tried to all sign, the IPTR request to show that we were united with this. I got the surgeons as well to agree to the proposal for this patient. That was turned down at the IPTR process level. At the appeals process, we sought advice from 10 specialists across the UK who were using this drug, which are presented at the appeal. Again, that didn't carry any weight, and they all agreed that we had met the criteria in the IPTR process. In addition to that, I had supporting documentation from the Professor of Medical Oncology and the Professor of Translational Research to say that I'd met the criteria in the IPTR process. And that was turned down, and I appealed the appeal with another letter from the Medical Oncology Professor, and again, that wasn't deemed to be sufficient. So I'm at a loss as to how I can access these medications for patients when I feel that I've done everything that I can do within the system and sought as much advice and support from eminent colleagues around the UK to support the application.
Does the SMC need, do they need more flexibility to allow them to look at that, or was it a bureaucracy that stopped them looking at that?
Well, I don't know. All I know is that I used to get this drug, and then NICE did a multiple technologies assessment on this drug, and that stopped me being able to access it. And a NICE multiple technologies assessment applies in Scotland, but in England, the patients can circumvent the NICE guidance through the Cancer Drugs Fund, but I am bound by it in Scotland still.
Nikki Crichton.
I think I mean, there is a disparity, obviously, in terms of the access in England because of the Cancer Drugs Fund. I think we've always argued that actually what we need to see is are improvements to the process, both in England and in Scotland, so that we don't have to have additional processes sort of tacked on to the end, if you like, so that actually the process approves some of those drugs where they are deemed to be cost effective, or that we decide that actually there are benefits to those particular treatments, and so they should be valued at a higher level, which again goes back to that discussion around value.
We've just heard of a story where that you know, there's a clinical expertise that frontline professors also, and there was an inability to respond. You know, I'm just wondering, is it the SMC's role, or do we need to create that flexibility to allow them to look at these things, you know, to respond to that sort of recommendation, as I think we had suggested earlier. I don't know. Jackie, you want a supplementary on this?
Yeah, I just want to appreciate this, because we're told, quite rightly, it shouldn't be politicians making the decision, it's all about clinicians, and Leslie was right to say there's a disconnect between what's said, that it isn't about cost, and actually people's real life understanding. But Dr. Harrow, I just wanted to tease out, you said you first sought, I think, kind of agreement from your own cancer team, is that right?
Well, I mean, the report suggests that, you know, we should try to get expertise, but, you know, in cancer we work within multidisciplinary teams anyway. We all collectively agree protocols and management plans, and we meet weekly to discuss complex cases. So, you know, we have consensus.
So your colleagues agreed with the IPTR request that you were to put in? Absolutely. Okay. You then got 10 consultants with expertise in the field to also agree?
Yeah, we proved the patient was different to the trial population, and we proved that they were likely to gain more benefit from other studies that were published. We sought advice from consultants around the UK who had expertise in that drug and this disease, and they all concurred with our finding.
And that was backed up by an independent expert in the shape of a professor?
That was backed up by Professor Evans at the Beats.
Okay. Can I therefore ask you, if this is based on clinical decisions, and it just seems to be the overwhelming kind of weight of clinical opinion was in favour of the patient receiving the treatment, who then is on the IPTR panel making the decision?
So there was an IPTR panel was convened, which is medical oncology clinical director, a general manager and a pharmacist. The appeals panel had the medical director, a lay person, and I can't recall who the other person. And then the third appeal, because I appealed the appeal, was a virtual appeal, and I can't remember the constituents of that process either.
Would it be fair, though, for me to say that actually if it was clinical opinion that decided this, the overwhelming weight of clinical opinion was in favour of treatment, yet the IPTR process resulted in a rejection?
Yes.
Okay.
And I submit in written format, and I did go along to the initial appeal to give a verbal account of the situation, but I'm not involved in the final decision making. And that's where I think there needs to be some inclusion of the clinicians.
And actually, the way you've done it is not just you individually being necessarily included, but there's a whole network of specialists that you've tapped into, and they have all agreed. Nobody's disagreed.
Nobody's disagreed, and you know, because you do, when you get rejected, you think, well, I've got something wrong, and so you seek advice and you seek support. Say, would you? And we've done that consistently, and it's not just me who's been doing that. I mean, and it got to a point that we knew we weren't getting forward with IPTRs, so we decided as a group to co-sign all applications.
So if it's about clinical effectiveness, then I think that demonstrates where the system isn't working.
Joan Fletcher.
Can I just echo on to that, Jackie, as well? We had the same situation. Unfortunately, we're not as fortunate as Dr. Stephen Arrows to have a full multidisciplinary and experts and a number of experts. But on the appeals that we've had experts from world-renowned experts have been given advice on 2 occasions, different world experts, and we were still rejected. And both the world experts on the clinical advised on clinically that the patient will benefit from treatment. Well, it did appear so, and it was felt like that by the patient and the people involved.
Bob Doris?
And tease some of this out. Dr. Harrow, you said you've clearly tried incredibly hard on behalf of your patient to get them access to this medication. You'd said that you'd proven that your patient was different from the trial population. But there was a final decision taken that you weren't party to where others were, I assume, in theory, making the exact same judgment call. Was this patient different from the trial population? For whatever reason, they looked at the evidence and they decided no in relation to that. I'm trying to be clear, and I fully appreciate your frustration in relation to that.
I think the phrase that finally came back was that we weren't different enough. Right. But no point in the IPTR process does it ask you to quantify the difference. It just says you need to prove the difference.
See, that's really helpful. That allows us to get more information in terms of how that process was being dealt with. Do you think whether it was in an active or a passive role, your presence at that final decision-making process would have added something to the mechanism in terms of informing? My understanding from what you've said so far is what you did was you submitted it and then they, behind closed doors, came out with a decision and informed you of it. Is that the process as it happened?
Yeah. Well, certainly for the appeal of the appeal. The initial appeal, I was there, but then what was asked to step out while they came to the final conclusion, which actually the appeals panel found very difficult to come to on that occasion and asked for extra time, because it is very complex. There's a lot of basic translational science, because what you're asking us to do is to come out of the evidence base. So therefore we have to go and find very complex supplementary evidence to back up the fact that this patient's going to do better. And so therefore I find that very difficult to understand. A layperson, I think, would find it extremely difficult to understand, and a non-specialist, I don't know how they can then come to the conclusion. And I think a very bold conclusion, given the fact that all the specialists and the professor of translational research was backing up our claim. So,
can I ask another question? Yes. In relation to this, is all very helpful. Can I ask another question in relation to this? Is there any possibility of the fact that the process by which this drug wasn't approved, because it was never approved by SMC, because that process was bypassed because of the multiple technology assessment by NICE, could that have in any way put an additional consideration, whether rightly or wrongly, on the group who finally decided that your patient wasn't different enough? Do you think that had anything to do with the process? Because the SMC has never individually considered this particular drug.
It's difficult for me to answer that because I don't know what the discussion was within the room, but I think that the decision that they were making was based on the evidence that I'd given them, and that was different to the evidence that was submitted in the NICE application. And in fact, in the NICE application, it said, in future, regarding the drug that I was wanting, if evidence was to come to light regarding BRAF status, then they would certainly welcome this in terms of forming their opinion. Now, subsequently, we've managed to start to get BRAF assessments done, and that was part of the submission. So what NICE was asking me, or asked us, or was suggesting may influence their further decision, we presented in the submission to the appeal, and it still was unsuccessful.
I'm not going to ask any questions on BRAF because that is way beyond my comprehension. I was really just trying to tease out whether there needs to be an improvement in IPTRs more generally, which is obviously there does need to be, which is why we're sitting around this table, and whether there's an issue with the multiple technology assessment by which you outlined. I don't have any other questions on that just now. I've got some other themes I might come on to later, convener, so I don't know if you had another committee member to come in at this point, or...
Julie Smith, is it on this area too?
Sorry, not dwell on this for too long, but I mean, it does seem to be again a disconnect between a recommendation that we have that we need to train some of our specialists to understand the process better, and I think Dr. Harrow's evidence indicates that a number of people understand this process very well. It's just that the process doesn't necessarily work. So I suppose the question that I have is around if you're reduced to trying to argue difference and sufficient difference, clearly there'll be an awful lot of work involved for you and your colleagues in trying to make that case that is, something that sits alongside all of the other pressures that are on clinicians' time. And part of what we're saying coming out of this review is, we need to, in terms of this process, think about the resource implications of this at the other side of the appeals process and the resource implications for yourself. Is your view that actually we're focusing on the wrong bit of where we're putting in more resource into an adversarial process between clinicians and a group that is apparently making a clinical decision but doesn't seem to be made up entirely of clinicians?
I'd have to say the hours of work that I have spent on this and my colleagues have spent on this is phenomenal. The amount of email traffic regarding this issue is phenomenal. It absolutely distracts from seeing patients and doing clinical work. There's no doubt about that.
You want to come back in?
Yeah, well, I was going to kind of move on. I think we have to, the committee's going to have to consider some of the evidence we've heard today. I was wanting to almost mop up some of the other points that have been made. I'm looking over at Leslie there because you'd mentioned some of those points. One of them was in terms of access to specialists, and I think Dr. Harrow made the point quite well that actually in terms of a lot of the prevalent cancers, the specialists, the preeminent specialists are the people putting in the IPTRs, but in the case of some of the ultra-orphan conditions, it can be more challenging. So just when I look at the recommendations within the report about the identifying who the national or indeed international specialists may be and having a register of them, maybe not necessary, and I think the recommendation does actually give a nod to the fact that may not be necessary in terms of things like managed clinical networks for cancer and the like, but is that a welcome, just for clarity, is that a welcome recommendation within the report in terms of how we manage ultra-orphans? Because there was actually a petition to this committee in relation to how we manage ultra-orphans, so just to get clarity on that, will that be helpful?
I absolutely think so. I think having a central list of specialists would be incredibly fair for patients in Scotland. One way of considering who a specialist is either to go through a centre of excellence. We happen to have one for our condition, and I think other ones are being considered for other ultra-orphan drugs, or perhaps somebody who is published within the field on that specific subject. Now, I think what we would never want to do, though, is to take away from the expertise and the very hard work that would be done, say, by a local clinician. And so one suggestion would be that those people, the experts on that list, would perhaps just need to be a signatory on the submission, so that a local clinician would still be responsible for the IPTR, but that specialist would be a sort of counter-signatory to say, yes, I completely agree with what's going in. Somebody that could be accessed by the IPTR panel for, as I've said, things like cost offsets or just an absolute understanding of the clinical benefits of the drug. So I have always wanted there to be a recognised expert for the ultra-orphan conditions.
I'm now going to give you a situation that may never materialise, but it's one I've been given some consideration to. We've just heard from Dr. Harrow about where he feels there has been preeminent experts who have given advice and recommendations, and for whatever reason the panel hasn't found them powerful enough, and we have to look at that process. But how would you see it if there was an ultra-orphan condition and there was a consultant who sought out the preeminent expert, and the preeminent expert said, actually, for whatever reason, I don't find this compelling enough to support the IPTR. should that have to be declared in any future IPTR submission? Because clearly what I would want to do if I was the patient, I would say go and find me another expert. But if you're getting the signature of that expert, it gives a weight and a gravitas behind that in terms of a decision-making process. So it's just how would you respond to a suggestion that if your consultant goes to and identifies this expert, the expert says, well, actually, even if they say I would quite like the patient to get this medicine, but based on the criteria, I don't think actually this is a goer. Do you think that should end the process, or that should be declared if you continue with the process?
I completely understand what you're saying about this concept of it being a gatekeeper, that sort of, it's their signature or nothing else. I can only speak for my own condition, and in my own situation, I know that the recognised experts, one, as I said, we have one Scottish expert based at Monkland Centre of Excellence, and we have several down south. They understand the condition so well that we have 30 PNH patients in Scotland and only 12 are recommended for the drug because they know who it will work 100% effectively for. I would sooner that happened than somebody went through the entire IPTR process, perhaps was given funding for the drug for whatever reason and it didn't work for them, because that's a complete waste. So I cannot speak for other conditions. I mean, I think my condition is pretty clear in a sense, and therefore I have no issue with that. I would sooner every patient had the chance of this expert saying, I understand this so well and this will work for you.
Okay. Any other comment? I was going to move on. Any other comments on that before I move on? Yeah.
I would endorse what Leslie says entirely. The only way that ultra-orphan drugs and patients with ultra-orphan diseases can be managed is by means of a centre of excellence or a centre of expertise. Generally, that's fronted by a senior, very distinguished clinician, and it works extremely well in practice.
From my looking at some of the evidence we've had, there seems to be a lack of clarity over, and I'm going to move away from the IPTR process in a second, during that final IPTR decision in relation to, are they judging on clinical evidence? And I'm not compelled that cost comes into it, but I'm wondering if they're trying to second-guess cost effectiveness when that's actually the job of the SMC. And I'm just curious in relation to that, which is different, of course, from the raw cost. My understanding is there's and I remain to be corrected, is there a risk share process between the health boards? Should this be, is the burden, if you like, of the additional cost for some of the more expensive medications, is it borne by all health boards equally? How does that work?
There is a risk share, which is the burden goes on all the health authorities. And the drug that pump patients need is actually mentioned on that risk share, but we can't access it because we can't get through the ITPR. So even though it is, so somebody's recognised that Myozyme is effective and should be on that risk share, but we can't access it because we cannot get through the ITPR process.
No, in terms of the risk share, is there actually a specified list of conditions by which? So maybe that's something the committee might want to consider in our reflections in terms of how do you get on that list of conditions or otherwise in terms of the risk share, and that's maybe of interest particular to the witnesses here today that are focusing on orphan and ultra-orphan conditions. Just to move us on to I think what dominated the first session, which was in terms of if the SMC gets this right in the first place. And again, I think it was Ms Lowlinger who mentioned the offset costs in terms of yourself, try not to personalise it to you, of course, but all across the board, of course, there's going to be savings elsewhere in terms of if you keep someone fitter and healthier and happier for longer, and there's less strain on carers and the family support network, and there's less breakdown of that. There are actually, I know there's social benefits to that we all want to see, but there's actually economic benefits to that. And I think part of the discussions we were having in the first panel is that everyone seems to have been holding their breath to await the outcome of this mystical thing called value-based pricing before we then look in greater detail of that. And we found out last week, I think, for the first time, and it came as a bit of a surprise to most people, that the value-based part of value-based pricing may not actually be reserved at all. Do you think the momentum now, and I'll stop looking at yourself, Leslie, I want everyone to kind of comment on this, my apologies. Do you think now the focus should be on doing some significant work in terms of how we get the economic and social modelling right? So the discussion that the SMC can have with pharmaceutical companies over is actually over the social price of medications, and that might actually put sometimes put more pressure on drug companies, but it sometimes give them a stronger arm by which to argue their case as well, and we might get more yeses. Is that where the momentum should now go from where witnesses are sitting at the moment?
Vicky?
Yes, I think we completely agree with that, and I think to echo your comments, there was a lot of surprise at some of the comments and discussion from last week's committee session. Our understanding, and Cancer Research UK has been quite involved at UK level in terms of speaking to the Department of Health around value-based pricing. Our understanding has always been that because of the pricing element in it, that would be reserved and therefore it would apply in Scotland, and so we've continued to call for further information on generally how the system would work, specifically how it relates to Scotland, and also in Scotland calling for the Scottish Government to engage with the UK Government to determine how that would work. It's not entirely clear following last week's session whether that is the case, and I think the first thing that needs to be done, as was mentioned earlier, is to get final clarification from the UK Department of Health on that issue. Is it just a development of the HTA process, in which case we absolutely should be getting straight into those discussions about how we want to take this forward in Scotland, or is there a pricing element that actually we do need to be taking into account? Because I think the comments that have already been made about feeling that there's a gap in this review that is to do with improving access is all about the fact that we were waiting for value-based pricing. And if it turns out that we've been incorrect in doing that, then we need to move fairly swiftly. But I think there is starting to be, coming out of the discussion here today, an idea that actually everyone is really on the same page in terms of the principle of what we want to do with that, and agrees with that idea of value-based pricing. It's just then how we actually apply that in practice.
Anyone else? Leslie?
Up on what Bob Doris was saying, I think the key thing is we do have an issue that we cannot get through, the ultra-orphan conditions can't get through the SMC because of the modifiers, the fact that our drug is too expensive to get through the SMC, and if we can bring that concept of drug offsets in at that level, then yes, we take away the need to be trying to push things through the IPTR system.
George Grindley?
In consideration to the social point and social elements will bring a bigger difference to someone like Leslie. And it's within that there's scope for change. And when the SMC meet, I think it'd be an opportune point to bring in a sort of citizens' council, a citizens' jury when the decision's made about orphan drugs or any new drugs onto the formulary. Because then you'll get both carers, people from the public with an interest in medications, making a valid input to the decisions of the SMC, which at the present time is not happening. I think it's a valuable point, and that will also bring in the social economic part of it as well, because a carer's time is unpaid, but the value to the person's life that they make is immense. So if the drug's going to give a better value of life and better quality of life to a patient, it's also going to give a better quality of life to the carer as well. And that's not taken into any basis at all.
Just on that wider involvement, it's reflected, in the recommendations and indeed was discussed at previous evidence sessions that we need to test public opinion here about what we want to pay for rare and orphan diseases and indeed end-of-life treatments and cancer and everything else. Do people support that point of view, or are you offended by that point of view? I mean, we don't have a citizens' jury to send a helicopter up the mountain to, you know, you know, how do you feel about that in terms of that whether treatment is provided to you, or indeed the people you represent, or the people you look after, should be subject to a citizens' review or opinion polling about whether that is legitimate cost that people want to pay? Vicky?
I mean, we would certainly welcome the general point about having that wider public discussion around some of these issues. I think how we would envisage it, and my understanding of what was being proposed in the review, is not that would necessarily be brought into individual decisions about particular treatments, but it's more about almost categories. So, for example, we might, you know, ask the citizens' jury to think about end-of-life treatments or orphan diseases, and almost have that debate in general, which would then be applied through modifiers to subsequent decisions, rather than it being involved in individual decisions. And I think that would be very helpful. I think one of the areas where we would perhaps want to suggest some caution is that we would want to be making sure that we speak to both the general public and also to patients in that, because we know that people living with a particular condition will have quite a different viewpoint on what is valuable to what the general public, who perhaps have no concept of what that means, but also have a stake in that debate as taxpayers. So I think it's important that we make sure that debate encompasses patients, because, for example, something with end-of-life treatments, we're not talking about gains in terms of people being able to return to work, you know, often, or savings further down the line, because they are often just life extending. But it may be, and there has been, you know, strong suggestions that the public does put additional value on some of those treatments, but actually we need to test that, ratify that, and then we can clearly say to SMC, you know, the public does think this is of additional value, and your modifiers should reflect that.
Anyone else? Ian McKerson.
Clearly there's no difficulty with patients being involved in all of these decisions. That's absolutely critical. I have some reservations, however, about members of the general public being asked to decide on what are extraordinarily complicated issues. They're medically complicated, they're economically complicated, they're even politically complicated. And the standard of education that you would have to bring to bear, have to provide for people on your citizens' jury, which strikes me would have to be very, very high in order to get the appropriate decision-making ability. I'm just slightly nervous about simplifying what is a horrendously complicated issue in that way.
Anyone else?
I think that I would agree exactly with what Ian said there. The principle of having some sort of citizens' jury is absolutely wonderful. And I think even from the public's perspective, it is about time that we ask the question, what do people want to pay for? But there is a danger, particularly from my perspective, from the rare diseases and the orphan side of things. They are extremely complex. People will not maybe be able to take on board really the complexity of these decisions, and might not be able to make a truly informed decision when discussing this. So there is a danger. Whilst the principle behind it is very, very good, we'd have to do an awful lot of work on how this would work in practice to make sure that it's done fairly.
Yes, Dr. Hahn.
I think that engagement of the public is a good thing. However, you know, these are extremely complex pathways. You've got to try and understand how the drug's working, the side effects of the drug. But you know, this isn't going to go away. I think the First Minister said these are exceptional times. Well, they're not exceptional any longer. This is how medicine's going. It's stratified, it's targeted agents. We are trying to tease out populations. So this is how it is now. It's not going to go back to a situation whereby you give a drug to all of your population. So we have to get our heads around the fact that this is how it's going to be. It's going to get even more complicated, and these drugs are going to become even more targeted and probably even more expensive as time goes on.
Gil Patterson.
Very point. We've heard a lot in recent months, in fact, since this inquiry, before this inquiry started. My experience, I took a members' bill through the Parliament on palliative care, and what I found was that with regards to quality palliative care, that the discrepancy between cancer sufferers and other life-threatening illnesses, you had about an 80% chance of receiving quality palliative care if you suffered from cancer. You had an 80% chance of not receiving palliative quality care if you had other life-threatening illnesses. So my question is this in regards to a cancer fund. What do the panel feel what would be equitable? Is it a cancer fund that we should set up specifically for cancer sufferers? Or should we have a fund that takes account of right across the board, and there's no exception based on what you're suffering from, whether that be end of life or otherwise?
No takers. Leslie.
Was set up at the beginning of the year, the £21 million fund, which I did want to talk about, and that was meant to be for any ultra-orphan conditions. So in other words, fewer than 1 in 50,000 of the population, in other words, fewer than 100 people in Scotland that would cover. However, it's been pretty useless from the point of view of actually accessing it, because you can only get through the Rare Conditions Medicine Fund if you get through a successful IPTR, and we can't do that. So there's only one group that have been able to get through and access that Rare Medicines Fund, and that's because their drug was deemed to be 100% effective, and therefore patients shouldn't fight with each other. Take this opportunity to say my drug's 100% effective too, so we'll happily have the access to the fund if it was possible. So there is the fund, we just can't get to it.
Anyone else?
I've always been against the idea of a cancer drugs fund, purely on the principle that it seems illogical to have one government body deeming drugs not cost effective and another government body saying which of these apparently not cost effective drugs do you want to use.
No other comments? I suppose the wider point I was making was that it's applied to new and developing drugs and medicines for cancer and rare diseases, but I mean there's a lot that goes on in the health service that's not evaluated in a similar way. You know, and you know, the comparisons has been made with free prescriptions as against, you know, and procedures and some operations and issues like that are not evaluated in the same robust way that new drugs and medicines are coming on the scene.
The point that we aren't in extraordinary times. These are the times that we're in, and we need to address these decisions that were made in the past that maybe aren't going to help us move forward for ultra-orphan drugs and for cancer drugs, if that's what society decides is how they want to spend their money. But this isn't just a blip in the process. This isn't just a blip in how we're clinically treating these patients. This is how it is going to evolve and continue to be.
Any other members? Jackie?
I just want to come back to, because I'm blown away by, you know, all your clinicians assembled on one side and an IPTR panel that says no and says no consistently. Would you having you in the room at the end have made a difference to that panel's decision? Or is there something not about you presenting, but there being an expert on the panel in the same field? Because there wasn't an expert in the panel from the same field.
Same field.
Okay. So it's maybe not about the applying clinician, but actually about somebody who is expert that is different, that has a role in the decision making, not simply as presenting. I mean, given that we're told that clinicians make the decision, and you've got all the clinicians with you, given that we're told it's about clinical effectiveness and all of those clinicians and professors lined up to say this would be clinically effective, would I be correct in saying that the only thing therefore left is money? That might be difficult for you to answer.
I think it comes back to the point that was made, which was that, and it wasn't explicitly said in the report I got back, but I can't remember the exact wording, but it was that they weren't different enough. And that was not, that was a goal post shifter. That wasn't what we were asked to prove. We were asked to prove the 2 points. We proved the points. We had support and documentation, and then it was said they didn't prove them enough. And because I think that because there's been advances since the multiple technologies assessment was done, and we can access the different genetic code within the tumour, which we've all presented, that it then becomes aware that actually, well, maybe this group that we said weren't going to benefit, some of them actually will benefit really well, but it's what proportion of that group that you don't want to give the drug to, you might then have to start giving the drug to, is then. So it must come down to cost.
Another way, because I think there was some discussion earlier on about the number of panels. Do you leave it to individual health boards to do, because we know that they do make different decisions on the same drugs and the same kind of indications in terms of patients. Is there a view that actually we would benefit from fewer panels, and that leads perhaps medical directors who have one eye on their budget to be slightly more relaxed because it's done at a regional level or indeed a national level? And I don't know if there's a view on that.
This is where having an ultra-orphan section would actually help, because, I would say that for certain conditions you have many experts who would be able to handle this, but from my point of view, from other ultra-orphan diseases' point of view, that would be the ideal.
Something that SMC could take on centrally. We submit centrally to SMC, and all the experts who have appraised the cost effectiveness and the data up to that point are there. And if we bring additional data to them, they're the ones who maybe are dealing with that system day in, day out. As I said, it took me hours to try and understand this system, reading multiple technologies assessments, SMC assessments, trying to understand the process. And it's not clear.
Fletcher.
I totally agree with both of you and echo on that. And I mean, the review has actually shown that different health boards have different forms to fill in and different ways of filling in the application. So bringing it all together centrally would make sense. And also, you've also got the budget already there. You've got your 21 million already there. So the process is halfway there, so take it a step further.
Yes?
Just to make a couple of points there, I can only talk about the Tayside IPTR request system. I have no knowledge of the Glasgow one. But one area where there is a little bit of nervousness is where you've got a big group of patients, and where we like to target treatments is defining which group of that patients will benefit the most. And the concern is of setting a precedent that in giving it to one, then you open the doors for everybody. I don't know if that's the case in Glasgow, but that certainly is a nervousness locally. The advantage of having a local group is, I guess with PNH, you maybe have a bit more time to make decisions about treatment, but with sort of late stage cancer, then time is precious. And to try and have a national group to discuss all these difficult patients would be, I'm not sure it would be desperately time efficient, at least with our local group, where the majority of one-off requests are, I can't put a figure on it, but the majority get approved. They get a decision often within a week of the request going in, and I don't think you could guarantee that with a bigger group.
I entirely mean it for something like myself, which is ultra-orphan, and we are looking at 3 patients that need the funding. So, I completely agree. There's absolutely mayhem if there were too many patients.
Any other questions from committee members?
Sorry. It's just to counter that, because I think this is worth just teasing out slightly. You have a case where a drug is available in, say, NHS borders, but the same drug for the same patient isn't available in Greater Glasgow and Clyde. And surely there is a way of balancing that local flexibility and speed with ensuring consistency and fairness.
I don't have enough direct experience of the IPTR process to comment on that, but I think broadening that out more generally to IPTRs and the Area Drug and Therapeutics Committees, and we would certainly have some concerns about ensuring that we reduce as far as possible variation in those decisions. Now, obviously, as far as IPTRs go, those are decisions about, or should be decisions about, individual patients, and therefore there will be differences in the decision, but there should be parity in the decision-making processes. Absolutely took on board the comments that Professor Swainson made about the wider role of Area Drug and Therapeutics Committees, and good reasons why those potentially should be retained. But I think attempts thus far to make sure that the process across ADCCs and across IPTR panels is consistent don't seem to have worked. And so if we're going to continue with separate health board processes, then there absolutely needs to be parity of process, of decision making, of making sure that the issues that are being considered and taken into account are the same issues, and that continues to be audited, so that if we are in a situation where there is still variation, then actually we might well need to look at a different approach.
No other questions? I mean, I'd say to the panel of witnesses, I mean, is there something that you wish to place on record here today that that we haven't covered? Vicky?
I just wanted to go back to the research point that was raised in the previous session. When we spoke to clinicians in advance of the last committee session before Christmas, a number of them did raise concerns about this issue of trials not being able to be run in Scotland where the comparators aren't in use. Now, I recognise what Professor Swainson said in terms of not having received any evidence on that, but it has been raised a number of times to this committee, and I do think it's an area that, if it's true, would be of great concern, and so it's something that we would be keen would be looked into further.
George?
As an ordinary person, I want person-centred healthcare. So if I've got a problem in Borders, say, I want that drug to be available on that session, but also in the formulary throughout Scotland, because I would find it quite difficult going from one health authority to another health authority, where in my own health authority it was agreed it was available, but going to another health authority in north of Scotland, it's not. And having to put in an IPTR request, I would find that really difficult as a person from Scotland. For a person-centred healthcare, it should be pan-Scotland for anything that's going on to the formulary. Because at the moment, each health board has the authority to accept or not accept SMC recommendations for new medicines.
Anyone else? It's an ongoing process anyway. If it's, you know, on the bus going home and say, "Wish I'd said that." You know, don't hold it. You know, email us, be in contact with the clerks. That's perfectly acceptable. But can I thank you all for your attendance and the time and the evidence you have given this morning. Thank you all very much. We suspend. We go into private session at this point, as previously agreed earlier on the agenda.